Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. So this is really, really exciting for us. Look, how many years ago was it when we went up to Oregon?
Two, Karen?
When we met you? How long? When was it? When did we meet you? 3 years ago.
3 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. So Paula, Chelsea, one of our volunteers, and for those of you that are in the room, you probably heard this part of the story. About 3 years ago, myself decided to go up to see this group called the Working Circle that was working with ranchers, and we didn't have an opinion really about ranchers that was either way. We just didn't understand why they wanted to kill wolves. So we as advocates decided to go up to this little town, Bonanza, Oregon. I think it's like 400 and some people in that town. It's a tiny little town. And we took our signs, was like, well, let's try and blend because they might not like us up there.
We were like, everybody wear plaid.
Yeah. So Chelsea and Paula, like two supermodels, put plaid shirts on. Like we didn't blend at all, and we took the magnets off the side of the truck, and we tried to look like we fit in, which we did not. And we snuck into the back of this tiny little library, had about 40 books in it, and all of these ranchers and everyone was in there, and Carter Niemeyer was in there, and we're like, oh, that's Carter, oh my God, so we're all excited, and we sat there and in the back, and we thought, no one's going to notice that we're here, and then
Until Karen decided to make each and every one of us introduce ourselves. And we were like, oh my God. So all these ranchers are saying, oh, I'm a rancher of this and that, and we're sitting there looking at each other going, oh God, what are we going to say? What are we going to say? So finally, she comes to us, and I just go, I look at Chelsea, and I look at Steve, and I go, hi, we're just citizens from California who really care about this issue and wanted to learn about it and see how we can help.
don't tell anyone we're advocates. We'll never get out of here alive. And that day was life-changing for us. After we left, we were making friends with the ranchers. Paula was sharing cookie recipes with people. We realized that these were real people with real issues, and they were good people. And when we got home, we called Betsy immediately, and we're like, when we do Sedona Wolf Week, we have to have a coexistence panel. And we were really trying to recreate what the Working Circle did. Well, today is a really exciting day because the band is back together, and they're all here. The original people that inspired us to have the coalition, the coexistence panel. Sorry, thank you. And so we're really proud to announce Karen Vardaman.
As she's walking up here, I just want to say that Karen is the founder of the Working Circle, and Working Circle Collaborative is actually the proper name for it. And it's been just such an honor to get to know her and to become her friend and to be able to support this. The one thing that really struck me about the Working Circle Collaborative is that they were able to create something very special, which was a safe space. At the workshop, you have all these people who are very defensive and scared, and they created this space in a way that made these people feel safe and like they could really open up, hear the information that was being given to them without being defensive, and share their concerns in a way that may have been scary for them in other circumstances. And so originally that was what we wanted to emulate, was creating that safe space. So again, I'd like to mention that, we have a room full of advocates today, and it is every bit as important for us as advocates to understand the plight of the rancher in order to help build that bridge and come together to figure out and help solve this problem that we're all seeing needs to be addressed. So I ask that we hold that space, we keep the space safe in honor of our intention here. Please keep all questions positive, and so that everybody feels welcome and safe and we can have a really productive afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. That's quite an introduction, my goodness. Wow, that was quite an introduction. I'm incredibly honored and more so incredibly humbled. It's been quite the journey for me, coming from the wolf advocacy side to where I stand today. And there were a lot of people part of that journey. Some of them you'll be hearing them speak today, that helped open up my mind and hearts to a greater picture surrounding wolf conservation. I want to thank you all for coming today. I think it's going to be an enlightening afternoon. You know, it's been an incredible few days. I have been so impressed by all the diverse efforts that are going into protecting and serving wolves. And, you know, I was talking to Paul actually this morning, I think, you know, it really does take a village, right? I mean, not one of us can do everything that needs to be done. And so it's great that we've got different folks coming from different places, offering their passion, their skills towards this cause. And it is a huge puzzle with a lot of dynamic and moving parts. And coexistence is part of that. And it's a very important, vital part of that puzzle to make this all work. But it's not easy. And there's certainly no shortcuts, as you're going to hear today. And I promise this afternoon will offer a lot of hope towards that end, but I'm hoping it'll also open up other folks' minds and hearts to the realities and challenges and hope when it comes to ranching with predators on the landscape. Our goal is to offer, you know, a variety of perspectives today, from advocates who support wolves, from those that are actually living with wolves and living this life each and every day. And then at the end of the program, I'm going to present a little bit on the working circle model and try to help tie all those pieces together. Each speaker will have an opportunity to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by a short Q&A. And at the end, we'll all come together to hopefully have open, honest, and meaningful conversation. We invite you to ask questions. Don't be shy. The hard questions are the best questions, because this is a really great opportunity for you guys to hear from folks like Hillary, like Joe, that are living this every day. So now what I'd like to do, so we can get started, is allow our speakers to just briefly introduce themselves. I always like to have people introduce themselves. And then obviously you've heard from Amaruk and Carter, who will have go first from the advocacy side and a little bit of the agency side, all the experience Carter's had, and then we'll go right into the ranching perspective. So Amaruk, you want to, for those that haven't had a chance to hear you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm Amaruk Weiss. I'm the Senior West Coast Wolf Advocate with the Center for Biological Diversity. I just realized I'm mic'd. I don't have to yell at you. Sorry. I'll use my inside voice. So I've been doing wolf conservation advocacy for the last 21 years, have had the opportunity to work for a number of organizations over those years, including the Mexican Wolf Conservation Fund, Defenders of Wildlife, the California Wolf Center, and for the last 6.5 years, the Center for Biological Diversity. I've also had the good fortune to be able to work on wolf issues in various regions of the country, including the Northern Rockies, the Alaska wolf and brown bear issues up there as well, also in the Southwest, and then of course on the West Coast. And I also work on the federal front.
Carter, do you mind?
Me?
Yeah, unless everybody here knows you.
Good afternoon. My name is Carter Niemeyer, and I am now a retired private contractor. But I graduated from Iowa State University back in the 70s and left Iowa, moved to Montana, got involved in predator control with working for Wildlife Services in Montana. I was a trapper supervisor for 16 years, and then once wolves arrived on the scene, I became the first wolf management specialist for the Northern Rockies region, doing, I was kind of the primary dog catcher. Any livestock damage had to do with wolves, so my job was to confirm if the damage was real, and then a lot of these wolves, live trapped them, footholds, helicopter, whatever. And then after 10 years of doing that, I moved to Boise, Idaho as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Wolf Recovery Coordinator in Boise, Idaho, and retired in 2006. And then since then, I've worked with academia and with folks like Karen doing the workshops and anywhere else that I can fill in and be helpful. Thank you.
Hillary or Joe? That's fine.
I'm Joe Englehart from Alberta, Canada. born and raised in British Columbia, Canada, on a small cattle ranch. And then when I left home, I started working on some bigger ranches. And of course, there's always wolves and grizzly bears. So yeah, it makes ranching pretty exciting and creates a lot of struggles too over the years. But yeah, just here to share my stories with you and share with you how I try to keep cattle and predators apart. Well, you can't keep them apart, but you can keep the cattle safer. Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm Hillary Anderson, and my husband and our 4 kids live and ranch in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, specifically in Montana. And we also have a lot of wolves and bears and have for a pretty 20-some years now. And like Joe said, it is an adventure, but we love it, and I look forward to sharing some of our stories.
Excellent. Well, you already know who I am, and just to clarify, I am with Defenders of Wildlife as the senior representative for the Rockies and Plains program. Put simply, the wolf rep for Colorado currently. So, excellent. Amarouk, thank you.
So we're doing short question and answer after each talk, too. Oh. Well, it's a good thing I didn't have to go to the bathroom. So, I am a biologist, a former attorney, and a wolf advocate. And I don't profess to represent the views of all wolf advocates because, believe me, there is not unanimity among all of us how best to advocate for wolves. There's not even a consensus about what are the best goals, strategies, and tactics to apply. But despite such differences, thank you. Despite such differences, I would say that most wolf advocates have in common the following ideals: that wolf management should be based on the best available science, that wolves are unjustly persecuted and need legal and regulatory protections, and that wolves are sentient, sapient beings with intrinsic value all on their own, apart from whatever values that we humans ascribe to them. For this panel subject, which is wolf-livestock coexistence, the primary outcome that is desired by wolf advocates is to have as few wolves as possible be killed, but also that agencies focus on non-lethal conflict deterrence and kill wolves only as a last resort, that as few livestock as possible are lost or injured or killed by wolves, that wolves are not killed for conflicts on public lands, and that wolf management policies and actions reflect what I would call a geocentric view. And what I mean by that is that it gives equitable consideration to the species' key ecological contributions and the sentience of the individual animals. Now, an ideal world would achieve these desired outcomes through state wolf plans, policies, and actions which are transparent, accountable, and enforceable. And additionally, these plans, policies, and agency actions would involve ample opportunity for public input, periodic environmental assessments to incorporate the current best available science that's been most recently published, treating wolves as an endangered species to recover instead of as a species to recover and to list with an end goal of hunting and trapping them, and management for the benefit of the public at large, not just for a certain segment or two of society. Sometimes the question arises, how do we reconcile wolf management for all the public and for future generations versus the right of private citizens to protect their pets and their livestock? Some of you may be aware that renowned biologist E.O. Wilson recently proposed that if we are to protect nature and prevent unprecedented species loss, we should, right now, set aside 50% of the planet as reserves for wildlife. And with that in mind, the public-private question takes on a whole new meaning. At least for me, it does. If you think about it, we humans, we can live in houses, apartments, duplexes, tents. We can make our home just about anywhere. But wildlife, their future depends on the presence of wild places and on humans not destroying wildlife and not destroying the places they need to live in order to protect our belongings. So our right to protect our belongings exists only to the extent that we can build fortresses around them. When we are out there in the wild, surrounded by wild things, and the only place left to them to live, I do not believe that we are there with a claim to a right. Not if that right is incompatible with wildness to live. From a wolf advocate's perspective, the primary goal as we enter wild places is to preserve and protect them for the sake of their wild inhabitants. And a secondary goal as we enter these wild places is to ensure that our activities cause as little damage as possible to them. So this is exactly where and why coexistence is necessary, rather than killing wolves or other wildlife. It protects our things, it protects them. It actually best ensures the safety of wolves and our pets and our livestock. Getting back to these fundamental principles, I'm going to take a moment to describe them, starting with transparency. So when there's transparency, before taking action, an agency is going to publicly express its intent, it's going to express the basis for its decision, it's going to update the public during the action, and then it's going to give like a post-action type of report. And that transparency can be in the form of documentation, postings to website, reports, investigations, the resulting conclusions, and I think just as importantly, lessons learned. Accountability refers to the fact that where actions are taken, there will be consequences. And where actions were not taken that were supposed to have been taken, there also will be consequences. Accountability is necessary by the agencies that are managing wolves and by livestock operators that are seeking agency actions on their behalf and public resources to protect their private for-profit business. As for enforceability, when there are principles being applied, there have to be mechanisms to enforce them, or what's the point? What's the point of even having the principles? Goals and objectives simply are not going to be met unless there's some mechanism of enforcement. So I'm going to give some examples, but first, know that in the real world, plans and policies are carried out by humans in an arena that's subject to and influenced by other humans, by politics and culture, which means that these ideals frequently are compromised, corrupted, and undermined. Drawing from my experience in the 3 West Coast states, which has been the main focus of my work for quite a number of years, I'm first going to give an example in Oregon of how these ideals were achieved and the results. Next, an example in Washington of where much, much, much work remains to be done to achieve those ideals. And then we'll take a brief peek into California, where I think the future is happening now. Oregon's Wolf Plan was adopted in 2005, and it was developed through a stakeholder process working with an agency, lots of public comment through multiple town halls around the state, and a written public comment period and testimony opportunities. It's an adaptive management plan with 3 phases, and what that means is over time, as wolf population grows, it drives the shift in management under the plan from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, and over time, management protections for wolves become less protective. So during the early stages of the Oregon wolf recovery, the agency responded to political pressure from the livestock industry to start killing wolves very quickly and skirt the wolf plan's requirements of documenting whether any non-lethal measures had been used, if so, for how long or what they even were. My organization and 2 others challenged these actions in court after our research determined that the Oregon State Endangered Species Act did not allow any person, including any agency person, to kill a state-listed species. Settlement negotiations took place and agreement between the parties was reached. The conservation groups, the livestock industry, and the agency all agreed that the agency staff should be allowed to kill wolves in instances of chronic predations, provided that in phase 1, the most protective phase, there were very high thresholds that had to be met for transparency and accountability. Those agreements were then adopted as regulations by the State Fish and Wildlife Commission and they were enacted into law by the state legislature. So that provided us with the enforceable rules and statutes. As a result, during the 2-year period that the lawsuit was going on and the negotiations were taking place, no wolves could be killed, and the agency staff and the livestock producers could only use non-lethal measures. And then during the 2 years after settlement was reached, wolves were still in phase 1, so it was still another 2 years before they went into phase 2, which meant those very stringent phase 1 requirements for transparency, accountability, and enforceability were all in place. In that total 4-year span, from the day we filed our lawsuit until 4 years later, no wolves were killed, the wolf population nearly quadrupled, and livestock conflicts declined. In addition, this required transparency meant that everyone knew what to expect. Everything was written down. Everybody knew what the requirements were. So the hysteria died down because everybody kind of knew their role in how this would play out to coexist and work together. So briefly, just to give you some idea, here are the key aspects of the Oregon settlement for phase 1. So first, when wolves are known to be frequently in an area and really kind of settling down there, the agency was required to post a map on its website called an area of known wolf activity. So this would literally be a map of a section of Oregon with a line drawn around it where they knew wolves were frequenting. Then, if a depredation occurred, the agency was required to draw a new map called an area of depredating wolves. Frequently, it was within the already existing map, so it would be just a smaller area in which the predations had occurred. Sometimes the depredations occurred outside of that area. Once that second map went up, the area of depredating wolves, the agency was required to contact all the potentially affected livestock producers within that area and work with them to develop a site-specific conflict prevention plan that would take into account the specifics of their operation and what was going on with the wolves and the landscape at the time. Non-lethal deterrents that were used had to be documented. There had to have been at least 4 predations in a 6-month period. There could not be any unnatural attractants present there, such as cattle carcasses left out. The rancher had to be in complete legal compliance with anything they had to comply with. So for instance, if the predations were taking place on public lands and they had a public lands grazing permit, they had to be in compliance with that. And if all of those circumstances were met, the agency was allowed to issue a kill order. In contrast, in Washington right now, we are seeing political, cultural, and managerial forces at play in an arena that is tragically lacking in transparency, accountability, and enforceability. Washington's Wolf Conservation and Management Plan was adopted in 2011, also after a stakeholder process with the stakeholders advising the agency, lots of public input, lots of town halls around the state and testimony and written comment opportunity. There was peer review by 43 scientists and another blind peer review done by 3 other scientists. The state also conducted a full scientific analysis of potential environmental impacts. This was required by their State Environmental Policy Act, or SEPA, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. From the plan's adoption in 2011 until the present, the agency has repeatedly killed wolves for conflicts with livestock. And over this 6-year span, the guidance that's been used by the agency to decide when to kill wolves has morphed from no guidelines to a very complex flow chart that they had in 2014, to a protocol they adopted in 2016, to a revised protocol they adopted in 2017, which is the protocol they're still operating under today. The 2017 and 2016 also protocols were devised by the agency with the assistance of a wolf advisory group known as the WAG. But there was no official public comment period requiring the public's views be considered. There was no scientific peer review. There was no supplemental environmental analysis done to look at the impacts of this protocol on the wolf population and the environment. The protocol is based on social compromises with a mindset that what is more important is relationships and processes, and the outcome is not really of any great importance. What it ends up doing is moving to kill wolves far too quickly without requiring sufficient, appropriate, or properly employed non-lethal measures. If science had been the touchstone for developing this protocol, the agency's ability to kill wolves would be much more conservative because the current best available science concludes that for a myriad of reasons, killing wolves to prevent conflicts is counterproductive. And science is also showing that non-lethal measures are actually the only measures that have been scientifically shown through the scientific method to be effective. The protocol also does not reflect the agency's mission, which is to protect and preserve Washington's wildlife. And the protocol and the kill orders fail to comply with two state laws, the State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA, and the State Administrative Procedures Act, or the APA. In combination, these two laws require that agency actions must be analyzed for negative environmental impacts. If there's new information or changed circumstances, they must conduct a supplemental environmental analysis, and their actions have to be based on a reasoned decision-making process. Yet despite the emerging science concluding there are negative impacts of killing wolves to prevent conflicts, and you actually can have counterproductive with more conflicts, the current protocol and the prior iterations, none of them have ever undergone an environmental analysis, and the agency simply refuses to do so. And yet, even as the agency implements that protocol, it even fails to abide by what its own protocol says. Where the protocol has expectations, and keep in mind, it doesn't even have requirements. It just says these things are expected. So again, there's no enforceability. Where the protocol has expectations for the use that non-lethal measures will be tried first, the record shows that the agency credits ranchers with having done non-lethal measures they did not do, crediting ranchers with having adequately conducted non-lethal measures when the evidence clearly shows that the measures weren't fully or properly conducted, and they credit ranchers with using certain non-lethal measures that are not effective in the terrain where they're being used. And I'm going to give some specific examples because if any of you have been following the situation in Washington, you know it's just been a crazy city up there. So what I'm going to describe has happened in just the last 2 years. In 2017 and 2018, relying on this 2017 revised protocol, the agency killed 3 members of the Smackout Pack and destroyed the Sherman, Togo, and OPT packs. In each case, they left behind only 1 remaining pack member, or only 1 adult pack member who was left all on their own to care for the surviving young pups. In authorizing the killing of these wolves, the agency credited ranchers with removing sick and injured livestock, when in fact they hadn't, even though we all know that those animals are vulnerable to predation and will attract more predators. It turns out that many of the calves with injuries on which the kill orders were based, when those injured calves were found, it was discovered that they all had prior injuries in various stages of healing, some of them as much as 2 weeks old. They credited ranchers with sanitation, even though cattle carcasses were left in the field continuing to draw in wolves so that new conflicts arose. And we know that because the range riders even reported that they could smell the stench of the rotting carcasses out in the fields, they just couldn't find them. They credited ranchers with using range riders, even though the range riders were never detected where they were supposed to be monitoring cattle herds. Even when the agency put trail cameras up in the area, the range riders were never spotted there until the agency required the range riders to wear GPS units so that they could monitor where the range riders were. They credited the ranchers with moving cattle away from high key wolf use sites like den and rendezvous sites, even though when the agency issued a kill order, there were still around 40 cows and calves milling around right on top of the wolf's den and rendezvous site. They admitted that right in one of our court hearings. So absent transparency, accountability, enforceability, public input, or incorporation of current science, since 2012, the agency has killed 22 of Washington's state endangered wolves. Of those 22, 18 have been killed for the same rancher. In the process, the agency has destroyed 5 packs for that same rancher. All but one of these kill operations and the predations have taken place on public lands, which already are highly subsidized by the public. Ranchers in Washington are entitled to compensation for confirmed wolf-caused losses at full market value and probable wolf-caused losses at half market value. But if the loss occurred on acreage of 100 acres or more, which is the case for all of these public lands, situations, they're entitled to double the payment amount. And while the state has 1.1 million cattle, it has only 120 wolves. As you can imagine, the public is outraged by what can be described only as the state's war on wolves. Wolf livestock conflicts in Washington exemplify what can go wrong when transparency, accountability, and enforceability are missing. And wolf advocates are working as hard as we can through various strategies and tactics to try to get this problem fixed and this boat turned around. So lastly, I'm just going to touch briefly on California, where wolf recovery is very much in its infancy with about 10 to 12 known wolves. Wolves are listed under California's State Endangered Species Act, or CESA, as we fondly call it for short. CESA is likely the most protective of any state endangered species act. It's closely modeled after the federal act. And at such low numbers of wolves, CESA strictly prohibits take. Wolves cannot be killed for livestock conflicts in California right now. And there have been several wolf predations on livestock in California since 2015. But livestock owners, with assistance from the State Wildlife Agency and with NGOs such as the Working Circle and Defenders of Wildlife, they are using non-lethal strategies and tools. So for all of us, no matter what our perspective, California is going to be worth paying attention to observe how things play out when killing wolves is not an option. And with that, I guess I'm allowed a few minutes for questions before we move to our next panelist.
One, two. Anybody have a question?
What phase is Oregon in now, and how is that working out?
So Oregon's state plan divides the state in half and allows wolves in each half of the state to go through phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Oregon also is federally listed still in the western 2/3 of the state, but federally delisted in the eastern 1/3. So in the eastern 1/2 of Oregon, wolves are currently in phase 3. Once they got to phase 2, they very quickly moved into phase 3 in terms of the numbers of the population. So right now, on the eastern half of the state, I should actually say the eastern 1/3 of the state, because still part of that is still federally protected, which makes it a little complicated for the agency. But let's just say in the eastern 1/3 of the state where wolves are in phase 3, they are treated accordingly under phase 3 under very lax management rules. In the western half of the state, wolves are still in phase 1, and part of the eastern portion where wolves are in phase 3, they still can't be killed because they're also federally protected in that portion of that part of the state. I wish I had a map to show you, but hopefully that explanation helped. Anybody else?
I just had a question on the one rancher who's caused 80% of these wolves to be killed. I'm trying to determine why it is so difficult to at least take action, or to have the state take action against that one livestock operator.
So there's not really any action they can take against him. The protocol applies to everyone, and the protocol does not differentiate between good actors and bad actors. And as Carter Niemeyer has said so many times, and he said it to agency staff, and he said it to the Washington director of Fish and Wildlife, because I brought Carter to meet with the director. You can't reward bad actors. If you kill wolves for bad actors, you're encouraging other people to be bad actors. You're giving them no incentive at all to change their animal husbandry practices or to adopt non-lethal measures, even if they're offered to them. You know, why would they? The protocol doesn't allow for it. We do have a lawsuit pending in Washington, and in our deposition of the lead wolf biologist, we asked him, and this is in the transcript of the deposition, why they weren't considering this particular rancher's actions, and he said, well, our protocol doesn't allow for that. So it's a problem.
So just for the sake of time, we have a lot of people to go through.
Yeah.
We're just going to have a couple of questions after each person, and then we have the happy hour afterwards where you can all talk to everybody and get information. So we're going to move on to the next person.
Can you all hear me? Okay, I don't have any pretty pictures I'm going to show with this presentation. This is sort of a walk down memory lane, kind of a spontaneous presentation because I just want to talk a little bit about non-lethal, as everyone talks about non-lethal coexistence. And it sounds really touchy-feely and like a simple solution, but I want you to know that it's not. And so today I'm going to kind of talk as a historian from my memory of, through my career, some of the non-lethal experiences we've had. First of all, realize too, there's no silver bullet. There's no technique that I'm aware of that works all the time, and there's a lot of techniques that work sometime, and there's some techniques that work better than others. Most non-lethal is a Band-Aid approach. You react to a particular situation and apply different remedies and hope that it works. And again, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So going back to the 1980s when we first had wolf problems in Montana, we had no experience, we had no equipment, we had no resources to work with. And non-lethal really wasn't even in our vocabulary or in our response plan. So the closest thing I would say back in the mid-1980s when wolves were recolonizing Montana was that we tried to clean up dead livestock. We tried to remove the carcasses of animals that were killed and just take that food source away and that attraction. And then the next thing too is if there were injured animals, you know, of course, remove them. And Amaruk kind of mentioned both of these things. So that's going back almost 40 years ago. We were applying these techniques and we were aware of that these things would help. It still doesn't catch on very well, and it just like herding cats again, trying to get people to do these simple tasks and take away that incentive for wolves to just keep hanging around looking for vulnerable stock. So then we went to things like scarecrows for a while, you know, and so use your imagination. You just nail some 2x4s together, wrap some chicken wire around them, and put your old clothing on them and poke them in the ground. And, you know, we used them on a project with eagles, and that seemed to work. The eagles thought there were shepherds standing out on the hills, so I keep offering that up yet to this day, that I think it can work as a Band-Aid, short term, where you have wolves coming from certain directions, up certain corridors, and just have them think, wow, there's somebody standing there watching, and maybe I better be careful. And then other techniques we used that worked was supplemental feeding, where you just ended up getting the livestock producer to take their livestock out of a vulnerable situation and feed them hay, and at that time, Defenders of Wildlife were providing the hay to offset that inconvenience and cost. And then we also suggested alternative grazing, where if you're ranching and feeding stock or grazing stock in a particular area, shift them around. And I think Joe and Hillary will talk somewhat about that. So I mean, these are things that can work. Then we went through a phase of non-lethal munitions. So picture a 12-gauge shotgun with projectiles that either shoot rubber bullets or beanbag rounds. And this is what police use today with protesters and rioters. They shoot them with these things. They're non-lethal, but they certainly hurt. Again, very seldom do ranchers see a wolf to shoot a projectile at, and I only know 2 cases ever that rubber bullets and rubber or beanbag rounds actually were fired at a wolf successfully. But ranchers kind of liked them for moving their stock around. You get an ornery bull that won't go somewhere, you shoot him in the butt with one of them, and they said, so they kept asking me, I can use some more for that purpose anyway. And then take it one step further, we had went through the cracker shell thing, which again they're useful, and this is a 12-gauge projectile that goes up in the air and explodes. And again, a lot of ranchers used them, and I think they're effective, but you got to be careful for setting fires. You can't really use them during dry season, or you could start a catastrophic fire and you got bigger problems than wolves. And again, the guys kept calling me about 4th of July saying they were out of them and needed more. And then one quick story, we met at the community center in Clayton, Idaho one year, and my partner Rick and I gave this talk, and most of the ranchers didn't buy into it, but just to win them over, we all went out behind the bar and shot at a garbage can and let everybody, have 5 shots apiece with rubber bullets and beanbag rounds, and told them it was an early tax return. And again, it lowers the temperature, I guess you'd say, when you're talking to people that just really are upset about wolves. And for a short time, and I still suggest them once in a while, is cowbells. Put them on your cattle. We found out when we were speaking in California, there's people using cowbells simply because they don't have drift fences, and sometimes cattle can go a long ways during roundup. It helps them find their livestock. So there's benefits to that, and I think the chaos can keep predators away too. Then we entered the phase of fladry ribbon, and I think most of you know what that is. It's just like a twine with red streamers hanging about every 18 inches on the twine. And it's been applied a lot and offered a lot, and it's effective on wolves in a real small restricted area, smaller calving pastures, or where the livestock is pretty close to home. And some ranchers have, especially with sheep, you can make night pens out of those things and hook them up to batteries. And my good friend Rick Williamson, who passed away about a year ago, he and his wife developed turbo fladry, which was an electrified version of fladry, and it was pretty effective. And you can put it around sheep for a night, put them all inside of it, hook up a battery and hook it to a solar panel, and it worked. And there's big rancher, Brian Bean in Idaho, who uses these routinely, and he has almost no problem with wolves and sells his sheep, markets them as predator friendly using this method. Then there's all these other things that have come and gone, and some are still around: air horns, starter pistols, anything that a shepherd or a range rider can fire into the air to scare critters away. And then we have what they call a rag box, which is a radio-activated guard. That developed in the Bitterroot Valley one night over supper. A rancher that we were helping, I caught and collared, well, I didn't catch the wolf. I took a wolf out of a coyote trap that a trapper had caught, and we collared the wolf, let it go, and then the rancher had us in for dinner. And he said, why don't you have something on them wolves that just triggers a bunch of fireworks, when they come around, and scare them away. And I presented that to our research group with Wildlife Services, and they come up with a radio-activated guard that worked off of a radio collar. So when a radio collar came within distance of the rag box, we had stereo speakers on it that set off sound effects: galloping horses, broken glass, highway traffic, cowboy is hooping and hollering, and in stereo, and it was deafening. And that worked. We used that in a couple of different ranches in Idaho and actually kept them away. One time we set it for close range, wait till the enemy approaches it, put it in a landfill where they were coming in eating on carcasses. Thing goes off at about 20 feet from the wolves, and I think it's tongue-in-cheek, and it's not going to happen always, but that wolf that set it off, we knew from the signal on the unit which collar it was. It went clear up into northwest Idaho after that incident, just plumb left town. I think it's more of a coincidence than an effect. So anyway, the rag box is still around, and our first one we built for a couple $100. Now I think they sell for about $5,000. But again, they're useful and work off of a radio collar where the wolves trigger it and scare themselves away. Which brings me to human presence. We'll get a little more real. And Joe and Hillary will be talking about this in detail, but I really believe that shepherds, guard dogs, in combination with sheep, are effective and useful. The guard dogs are there to warn the shepherds. They're not there to fight the wolves because the guard dogs will be killed. But in combination, when the dog can bark or multiple dogs bark at night, it wakes the herder up, makes him aware that there's predators around, and then the shepherd can fire shots and go out and at least back up his dog and help run off anything that's threatening. And human vigilance in all forms, just checking your stock, being out there with your livestock, it's really hard to get people to do that because the habit has always been turn your stock out, and a lot of times on public lands a long ways from home, and sometimes a lot of people don't get around them very often, and a lot can happen if you're not taking care of your stock. I'll leave that to Hillary and Joe to talk about. Range riders, I absolutely believe they're effective, but I can tell you 1,000 stories that a useless, lazy, ineffective range rider is, you might as well leave him at home. And the guy that gets up at 9 in the morning and never leaves a county road, runs around the county road without having to go out in the woods and go near the wolves, and always goes to bed at night exactly when the wolves are waking up to come and visit the livestock. It's not going to work. But with good range riders, again, you'll hear these speakers tell you how to do it the right way. And the latest one, Band-Aid approach, was, I don't know what you call him, Airman or Turbo Man, that was used in Oregon to keep wolves away from a fellow's ranch. And he's lost a guard dog and a calf since that's been applied. So I think that was a quick test that it worked maybe, but probably not. And the other thing, just think about with all this non-lethal possibilities, especially range riders and shepherds and such, I keep suggesting you look at the cost benefits. Washington is a living example of spending $135,000 on helicopter time trying to shoot a pack of wolves in 60-foot timber, and it's mission impossible, and I call those areas indefensible. You can't really, you tell the ranchers, all right, you meet these protocols and we're going to come in and kill the wolves, and you can't even do it because you can't get at them. So you spend $135,000, you get some of them, but you don't get them all. You didn't solve the problem. What could you do with that money rather than trying to kill wolves? I guess I'll just quick sum up that these working circle workshops, I'm working with Karen and the others here because I think they're important just to break down barriers. We're not coming with anything threatening other than information, and with Hillary and Joe especially, being livestock handlers, they can tell people ways that you can live around wolves and bears and lions and other predators, and they're living examples that you don't have to have problems. But you got to accept that, and you got to want to do it, and if you don't, I guess nobody can help them. But I would like to see the day when people show compassion for their livestock and for predators, and if we can keep them apart, then there's no need for either one to die. Thanks.
Two quick questions, anybody? All right, then we'll just move on to the next person. Sorry, sorry.
You can't ask.
Do you think wolves react more to sound-related non-lethal stuff or visual?
Well, I'm going to, again, suggest that Hillary and Joe are going to talk about this, but I think it's the threat of humans being around. But I do believe in firing gunshots. I do believe in harassment and the ability for humans, whether range riders or shepherds, to be able to scare these animals and create a threat to them and a risk to them coming around stock. It's really important. The problem with a lot of these states, when you first have wolves around, the state or federal agencies put all these restrictions, and especially say you can't harass them in any way, you know. And I think harassment is good, and it's going to keep wolves alive, or other predators too, rather than just have to sit there and watch them and let them habituate to human presence where they see no risk of a harm. So anyway, having people out there, I don't think you can beat that.
We're going to change it up a little bit and I guess kind of get to the meat of where we're going, no pun intended, ranching. But I think it's really important for folks to hear from people who are actually living it. This is their lives. They're out there living it every day. They're not sitting behind desks. They're not writing science papers. They're the ones living the realities of ranching with wolves. So.
Sorry, I think I need to stand here so I can actually see what I'm supposed to talk about. Okay, I'm all right here. So I wasn't going to start this way, but I think I am going to read you a quote that I just was screaming at me loud and clear over the last half hour or an hour. So I'll read it. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. So the reason I wanted to share that with you, I guess the discussion on Washington, and this isn't what I was going to talk about, but I wanted to comment on it really quick. You know, the thing with Washington is that they did fail. Like, it wasn't that great. But you know, the other side of the story is that no state has actually ever attempted to do what they did. And none of us, including Joe and I, who live this reality every day, know the right answers. But they dared to step into uncharted territory. You know, Jay, Aaron, all those guys, I know most of the people on the WAG. And if you actually sit down and talk with any of them, they're good people who probably resonate with most of your values. And you would probably resonate with most of theirs. And so the thing is that I think that we need to start shifting from a blame game, you know, because blame is really just pain that's undealt with. And we really need to start shifting to a culture where we lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Because, you know, the issue of wolves is a tricky one. But the more you get into wolves, the more you realize it's actually not about wolves at all. It's all about people stuff. It's all about people stuff. And so it's in figuring out how to empower each other and bring out the best in each other that we're going to get through this. Because, you know, I talk and live with ranchers every day. That's my life. I'm also a wildlife biologist. I've worked side by side with Doug Smith and had followed wolves up and down mountains for years, and I appreciate both of them. And I see the best in both of them. And so does people like Carter, Karen, and Joe. And it's in the work that they're doing where they're looking at how can we give the most generous assumption, how can we make the most generous assumption about these individuals, that real progress is made. Because most ranchers, maybe for the first 15 or 30 seconds of talking about wolves, it is about wolves killing livestock. And there's always the extreme ends of, people who are just set in their ways and not going to budge and really angry about past childhood traumas that they haven't dealt with and all that. But, when it really comes down to it, most ranchers aren't anti-wolf. Most of them, if you really talk with them, they're just trying to make a living out there, and they're the best conservationists. And I guess that's where I'll start this. So I live in ranch just north of Yellowstone National Park. This is one of the ranches up in Tom Minor Basin that we live on. We've had wolves since about 1997, 1998. And, we've made a lot of mistakes, lots of mistakes in that time, but we're continuing to try. And I guess it's an adventure that we care very much about. And what I'm going to share with you over the next couple slides is part of our story. This is one of our permits here. This is Yellowstone, and we call it the Wild Working Landscape. Some of our neighbors call it Jurassic Park. We have one of the top highest densities of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. We have a wolf den actually on the ranch. This is not the breeding female, but over the last 6 years, she's had 23 pups on the ranch itself. But what I wanted to point out, I guess, really importantly, I think that sometimes we tend to forget, like in this little guy here, there's things about, endangered species and private and public working lands. The thing is see, this is a map of private and public lands in the southwestern corner of Montana. Here's wolf packs, okay? This is Tom Minor Basin, this is Centennial Valley, this is where we live. Every single one of them lives on private property. And the thing is where wolves don't live, well, maybe I lost the slide. The thing is where wolves don't live is in subdivision. And so it's really, really important, I think, whether we care about ranching or think the livestock industry could do better, the fact of the matter is that the majority of wolves in the state of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming heavily depend on private working landscapes. And so it's in our best interest, all of us, I as a rancher, you as a conservationist, I as a conservationist, it's in all of our best interest to protect these both private and public working lands because they're the ones that are holding space for all of these values that we so greatly care about. That said, having wolves and livestock together comes with some hard realities. And I guess our approach, and it didn't come easily, but our approach really is to shift from a reactive mindset, which Carter was and Amaru kind of talked about, which is kind of really heavily rooted in the wildlife management side of things, to really taking a proactive approach to minimizing livestock loss due to predation. And for us on the ranch, that it has come to equal strategic land and livestock management. And which means getting creative and thinking outside the box and doing stuff that's never been done before. And all of that leads to our goal of resilient ranching. Because if we're able to maintain habitat like this, the thing is that the cattle are a means to keeping these landscapes open for us. They're the way that we're generating revenue and a livelihood. And by maintaining those open spaces and holding space for all of the different values that we care about, we collectively can get there. So Resilient ranching for us means growing the capacity of the people and landscape to hold multiple values and withstand the tests and changes of time. And there's a subdivision picture. So the reality is that not many wolves live there. And when you lose this, especially right outside of Yellowstone, it eventually becomes that. And that, you know, that's just another side of the story. And I think it's something worth considering really, really deeply. So back on the ranch, our strategic land and livestock management, our goals of that proactive approach, you know, we're not actually doing those efforts to try to save or kill wolves. It's not really about saving or kill wolves. We appreciate the wolves, we appreciate the bears, but it's about running a good agricultural livestock business. And so we really work to do this idea, and see right here, this picture is, we're working with this herd of cattle before we turn them out into this country back there, and this is Yellowstone right here. And so we're working with those livestock to do something called rekindling the herd instinct, and that really came to us from learning and watching what the bison do. So elk, you know, for those of you who follow science from the park, elk run, they flee the majority of the time they're encountered by a predator. Bison mother up and stand their ground. Wolves are very successful at hunting when they get their prey on the run. And so if we can keep calves with mother cows and mothers with other mothers, then our cattle are much more likely to behave similar to bison. And you know, for us, we gave up trying to deter wolves and grizzly bears a long time ago. We have wolves and bears coming out of our ears. And so what we really wanted to do was just make our cattle, our livestock, the least vulnerable option out there when they were encountered. And so after doing this method across 61 herds for 5 years, of the herds that we kept mothered up and gathered, we've had 1 loss. Of the herds that were scattered, we've had 32 losses on calves and 2 on yearlings. And so I think that I think we're on to something. This works for us. The interesting thing is that we didn't do this necessarily because of the wolves. We did this because from a conservation standpoint, we are very invested in healthy soil. We are very invested in healthy range, healthy, thriving riparian areas. And the thing is that mimicking nature's model by following the bison was in our best interest, not just economically or ecologically, but economically as well. And so that's pretty exciting stuff. The thing that we have to be careful about is that this approach was born. It was born by our investment out there. It wasn't us going to a lecture. It wasn't someone saying, here, do all this and it will all work out. It wasn't that. It was other people saying, hey, we believe in you guys. We want to see you succeed. You go out there and create what you know best how to create, and we'll support you in doing that. And so, you know, this might not work in Washington. This might not work in Oregon. This might not work in California, because everybody and everything is different. And so the way that we got to a solution was by being empowered by our team, not by being criticized at every effort we made, you know, and have the light shone on us for all the mistakes we made. And so, yeah, we got to a good place. We are in a good place. I think we have something good going on. We spend a lot of time out with our cattle. That's a huge shift from the traditional sort of ranch model of that I call turnout and checkout that Carter alluded to, or traditionally, you know, everybody has public lands grazing permits, and you turn cattle out and you go home and hay and irrigate and do all the other work you need to do. And before wolves and bears, that kind of worked. It worked good enough. The thing is that it doesn't work so well now, and so we've really invested in increased human presence, but like Carter said, human presence is not just somebody wandering around out there. It's very strategic human presence. But again, nobody told us what strategic human presence was. We had to be given the support to go out there and try it. hey, this didn't work. It was a complete failure. What can I do different next time? And adjust. And so we got to a point where it's like, hey, if I ride from this time to this time, that's pretty darn effective. If I gather the cattle up like this, here's areas where the cattle like to be, here's how I can move them, here's where I need to be. Oh, and hey, we got through another season with no losses and all the pups survived. You know, and so, but it doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen with someone coming in and saying, you did all this wrong and you should have done this, because it just doesn't work that way. The other thing that we've invested in largely because of the grizzly bear part, but I'd say it's absolutely true for wolves too, we just don't have a way to separate wolves versus bears, is carcass management. What I will say with wolves is we've had, traditionally speaking, ranchers have bone piles or carcass dumps, you know, stuff dies, you put it all and take it all to one spot. The thing is that everything out there knows knows how to find an easy meal, and these spots become tricky, especially when you add grizzly bears into the mix and heavily influence how predators use the landscape. And so we do a lot of, again, kind of strategic, creative livestock or carcass management sorts of practices to try to not influence the predators, not let carcasses be in close proximity to live livestock. And I could talk about that for a long time, but general gist is that's a practice that we do. And actually, I'll just share one thing on this is a really good example of what I've been saying, is that a community north of us had a really exceptional carcass removal program that they created. And it had actually decreased their grizzly bear losses by some 90-something%. It was a beautiful collaboration, super successful. We said, hey, we have grizzly bears, we have depredation, we want to do that. And we went to try and do it, completely didn't work, because we have a completely different situation. So we took pieces of that and tried to mix and match and put them together in different ways, read our particular situation, really invested in observations, being out there, a part of it, and pieced together something that's completely different than the community north of us and is very reflective of our particular situation and completely solves our particular challenges. So these pictures here, I think, are my summary of ranching at its best is also conservation at its best. So this is a picture on the ranch where we've brought back endangered Arctic grayling. We have significantly increased our sage grouse numbers. We also run a profitable livestock operation. And then this is that breeding female. She's been with us on the ranch for years now. And so, you know, again, back to my original comments at the beginning, is that the success of one, the big epiphany for us is like the success of one, meaning conservation or agriculture, does not have to be contingent on the failure of the other. And that actually, like I said, ranching at its best is conservation at its best. And at the heart of all of that was a core group of people, not just one family, not just one person, but many, many stakeholders who are all willing to risk stepping into that arena and have the hard conversations and really listen, really hear what the needs were. And the thing is when you really start listening, what you hear the needs are actually probably your needs too. It's really amazing how that happens. And so this is all the agencies that we work with, including Wildlife Services. This is all the NGOs, 5 different NGOs, Defenders of Wildlife, NRDC, Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a number of NGOs there, multiple ranchers from the community, and then a few folks outside, you know, next tier out of the extended community. And we host workshops and range tours and school groups and classes all the time on the ranch to come step out here with us. Like, let's see the cattle, let's talk about the grass, let's look at these riparian areas and strategize together. and it's not a one-man show. So I'll end on this, that healthy things, cattle, wolves, watersheds, communities, economies, and nations depend on a foundation of healthy relationships. This was in the middle of one of our largest depredation events that Karen was actually there for, and it was 14 goats were killed by one wolf out in the middle of the day. And you know, the thing is that the herder did a poor job. He completely dropped the ball on that, but not one of those people turned on him. They're like, hey, you know, what do you need to do it better next time? How could we support you different? So let's all get together. Again, here's the ranchers, range riders, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the herder, he's in the back of the picture. You know, hey, let's talk about this. What could we do different next time so we can all get closer to where we want to go? And I think if we could do more of that, we'd all get a lot closer to what we want, because the thing is listening to Amarouk's presentation, I was like, I pretty much agree. Like, I actually hold all those same values, you know, and there's no question that there's a lot of bad examples of ranching out there, but there's a lot of good examples of it too, and there's a lot of potential for the people, like in this case, the herder, who aren't doing it that great, to do better if we believe in them, if we empower them. And he is. He's now doing terrific. We have the goats every year. We have the goats because of the weeds. We're managing the weeds and the range, and the whole picture comes together really nicely. So that's all I have for you.
That's great, thank you. A few quick questions. We do have the panel after this, so there will be a lot of questions then, just to let you know.
I was just curious about the herding instinct of your cattle. Did you have to teach that, or is that still genetically in them?
Both. Yeah, the very, very quick answer is that there's no question that genetically we have changed breeds like Black Angus because we've selected for just carcass quality for so long. But within that breed, we can still select for mothers who are genetically very good moms. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that Joe will probably touch on is stockmanship. A very different way of handling cattle than like the yeehaw cowboy thing and barking, biting dogs. It's a really completely different way of working with livestock. That's psychological. You're working with their mind, not physically forcing them to go where you want them to go. And when you work with their mind, just through proper positioning and timing of pressure and release, you can have hundreds of cattle file right on a truck or right into the next pasture, or want to be with their calf. So, yeah. Yep. Oh, so. No, we don't do any of the cutting horse routine. You know, it's all, again, really both horse, dog, human, and cow, not to mention all the wildlife. It's really a whole redefining our relationship with all of them.
So when you're talking about pressure and release, though, that was more what I meant. Are you just using horses to kind of, and dogs to kind of encourage them back to what you were talking about, to herd together, and seeing how that works, and then gently doing it again until they sort of see if that kicks in? Is it usually more?
Yeah, so the thing, real quick, again, cattle seek comfort. And so comfort to them is no pressure. So if you're driving a herd of cattle and one goes to leave the herd and you send a bunch of dogs around her and chase her back into the herd, the thing is that she associates the pressure from the dogs with the mindset of going toward the herd. So then she associates the herd with the pressure she felt, and she thinks, where was I comfortable? It was when I was leaving and there was no dogs. And so it's a reverse kind of psychology from how we want to think, and it's very animal-centered, not human-centered. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we should.
I actually have a question from someone who's watching the live stream.
Okay.
This is a question from someone named Shane Stewart. And he said, are you teaching your cattle how to defend themselves like bison do, rounding them into a circle and defending themselves with their young in the center, like we've seen bison?
Yeah, cattle, the thing, like I was saying, of the 61 herds over 5 years, cattle, moms that stay with their babies and with other moms in a herd, and therefore are able to mother up and stand their ground when approached by a predator, naturally, and I wouldn't say naturally as on day one. I think it took some time for cattle to get used to wolves and bears, but absolutely. Yep.
Time we're going to move on, and we're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end with the panel.
How's everybody doing? Good. I'd just like to thank Hillary for her good description of ranching with wolves. Hopefully I can measure up here. I guess I'll start kind of with a little bit more of my story. Born and raised in British Columbia on a small cattle ranch, and then when I left home, went to work on some big ranches where one place I worked on, there was about 9,000 cow-calf pairs, and there was a crew of about 12, or at the heat of turnout, there was probably about 20 of us. And then I worked on various different ranches too that had in between numbers of cattle and size of acreage size too. So, and all these places that I worked on had grizzly bears, wolves, black bears. So yeah, my practices have changed quite a bit over the years. I guess probably 20 years ago, I kind of realized that just shooting wolves because they're killing cattle is pretty counterproductive, because it seemed like the more wolves you shot, the more you always had wolves coming back in killing cattle. So about 20 years ago, the place I'm working on now, I had the latitude to implement some different management strategies. And I kind of took my focus off the wolf and put more focus on the cattle, and on the cattle, the grass, and the water, all the stuff that mattered, and just kind of let the wolf be a wolf. But that entailed me being out there more. So when the wolf sees me out there, it's not that he's going to just vacate the place, but he's not going to hang around the cattle as long as what he normally would. Carter also said earlier that we don't want to encourage bad behavior. So I guess that can be taken two ways. If I've got a pack of wolves that are displaying bad behavior, I sure don't encourage that either. So I have had to shoot wolves. It's been 15 years since I've had to shoot one. I'll just start clicking through here. Uh-oh, I knew I'd do something wrong here. There we go. We were talking about low-stress livestock handling. That's a pretty big one with me. It's something I'm still learning. I hope I never quit learning it. It's no different than my horsemanship skills. Something that you never want to quit learning. But just an example of how I like to see cattle move. They're paired up. They're not running. They're just kind of at a casual walk. I can't remember exactly. I think this herd was about 200 pairs that I put into an allotment, usually the middle of July every year. And they, in that allotment is right where there's usually the middle to the end of July, there's a rendezvous site. So pretty important to keep them calm and quiet when they go in there. Wolves kind of seem to like chaos. And mismothered cattle and like cows and calves that are mismothered is a pretty good example of chaos. Stockmanship, manage cattle, not wolves, like I said earlier. Rekindle the herd instinct. One thing I've noticed, and Hillary talks about it too, cattle that are exposed to wolves all the time will start doing this by themselves, without the human helping them do it. But I kind of like to help them along with it to get it all working when I need it to be working. And it also makes it easier to see those cattle. When I ride out into an allotment that might be 5,000 to 6,000 acres, if those cattle are scattered all over that allotment, it's going to take me quite a while to see those cows. So if I can get this working for me to where they might not be all in one tight bunch, but they're not going to be scattered more than a square mile. So it's easier to find your cattle. Makes it easier to treat them if you have to doctor something for pink eye or foot rot or something like that. And if there is a dead cow, you might have a chance of finding it. Let's say a grizzly bear or a wolf or a cow eats poison, you're going to be able to find that carcass a lot easier. Being present and engaged with the landscape, pretty important to me. I spend a lot of time, even before I get cattle on my allotment. Usually the 1st of June I start bringing cattle in there. And cattle are there till the middle of February, the last bunch leaves. But before I bring cattle in there, I spend a lot of time knowing where the wolves are, where the den sites are, grizzly bears. I try to document everything I find and try to make up my grazing plan to where I'm not going to be bumping into wolves. Grizzly bears are a different thing. They just kind of go wherever they want, But definitely wolves. If it was just wolves, it would be easy. Grizzly bears and people can make things a little tougher. A lot of the stuff I just talked about. Low stress livestock handling, the benefits of quality of life for your cow herds, pretty important. It seems like we're more and more in the public eye, which I think is a good thing because I have seen examples of livestock producers that probably shouldn't be in the public eye. So I take a lot of pride in being able to look after livestock and keeping everything pretty happy and calm. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the old John Wayne movies and different cowboy movies where every time they're moving livestock, it's at a run and everybody's yelling. So, yeah, that's really not something that I'm interested in. And if you're going to have weight on your cattle to ship them in the fall, that probably wouldn't work very good either. So, high survival rates. I can't really read that. Yeah. and efficiency of your operation. Like I talked about earlier, if you, the place that I look after, there's about, when all the cattle are in there, there's about 8 different herds on eight different sections of the ranch. So I try to get through at least 3 herds a day, sometimes more if everything's ticking along good. But if I'm having problems in one area, I might only get through 2 herds in a day. So if you can have your cattle bunched up and easy to find, I guess not easy to find, but easy to ride through. You know, they're not going to scatter when they see you. It ends up in the end, all these added benefits puts pounds on your cattle and puts a steak on the plate for the consumer. Horses are a big part of the operation. Most of this country is, some of it you can get around with an ATV, but most of it, and I prefer not to, most of it's got to be done on horseback. I do use ATVs to fix fence and that kind of stuff, but I'm usually mad by the end of the day when I get home with an ATV, so I'd rather be on a horse. Vulnerability in livestock seems like all over Canada and the U.S. You see little situations like this where there's 1 cow and about 4 calves there. The other mothers might be close by, but maybe not. You know, little narrow valley with timber on both sides. And if there was a rendezvous site or if there was a pack of wolves close by there, usually during the day where those wolves are going to be is up in the timber, not too far up in the timber, just up where it's cool. And they'll, long about an hour before dark is when they start coming out to check out these cow herds. And maybe there's a bone pile there they've been visiting, which quite often is the case. So vulnerability in cattle. I try not to, with the low stress livestock handling and strategic placing of cattle on allotments, away from attractants, kind of keeps my cow herds from being as vulnerable as something like this would be. Here's an example of one of my allotments. It's, I guess this allotment here would be about 4 sections, 650 acre sections. And I put about 400 cow-calf pairs in there. Usually, I try to alternate my grass. I'll start early one year, and mid-season the next year, or late the next year, and then mid-season. Just to kind of give that grass a chance to grow every 3rd year during the growing season. But this is kind of the way I like to see a bunch of pairs move along, just strung out, pretty happy. I do use dogs, but there are days if I know that I'm going to be near a rendezvous site or a den site, I'll probably leave the dogs at home, just to keep my dogs safe. If I have time at the end here, I'll tell a story about wolves and dogs. Here's another example of low-stress livestock, the way I like to see stuff going on. I guess I'll touch a little more on that. It's working cattle through feel instead of by force. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Ray Hunt or Tom Dorrance, kind of the great champions of the horse world. That's kind of how they handled horses, was through feel. You know, starting from where the horse is, throwing the human ego out and kind of working on the same level as the animal. So it doesn't all come easy. When I started doing this, there was lots of bumps along the way. And I'd get frustrated and go back to hooping and hollering sometimes. But over time, I started seeing how things were working better for me. Because I definitely wasn't raised handling cattle this way. So I graze a lot of cattle in the winter time, and this is southwest Alberta, so we don't always have snow there. So and the one thing about, especially in the winter time, is I always have cattle, elk, moose, and deer overlapping one another. And I believe the reason I have so many elk and moose and deer is because of proper grazing of livestock enhances grassland, and that allows me to have. So I'm pretty happy about the wild ungulates I have. But it does create a challenge too, because wolves follow elk, and elk are right in where the cattle are. Here's an example. This is a video. Can I play it? Now these two dogs are just first-year pups, and this bunch of cows had wolves in them the day before. And you can kind of see the reaction of these cows. This black pup, he's kind of doing what I want him to, but the female, she's pretty aggressive. I'm not saying all females are aggressive. And that's how I communicate with my dogs, is with a whistle. I think that's it. But that's just an example of how protective a bunch of cows can be. Especially that old cow at the back there. She's kind of helping me train that dog a little bit. And this here, I'm actually, if you look to the back of the picture there, that's kind of where I'm moving those cattle. Doing a little bit of a spot graze in an area that, you know, sometimes early in June, it doesn't get grazed enough. So what I'm trying to do is bunch a bunch of cattle up in there and have them graze it for a couple days. And through this method I've been learning over the last 20 years, I can move a bunch of cattle in there, and as long as it's done properly and they're happy moving, when they get to where you're going, the water hole is actually just back behind me in the picture. It took me about 3 days, but I had about 400 pairs staying up where I wanted them to graze, and they would come back down to the water hole and go back to where they were grazing. So that was kind of a feather in my hat there. After I move a bunch of cattle, I like to, if things aren't mothered up good enough, this bunch of cattle has only been about 2 hours before this. They just got off trucks and were brought from their owner's place. And so I trailed them out about 3 miles, and then I'm just kind of letting things mother up here. I like to leave a herd in a spot where they're not in a traveling frame of mind anymore. And you can almost see where everything's not facing the same direction here. There's still a few of them that aren't mothered up real good, but I think it was probably 20 minutes after I took this picture, I was able to leave them, come back the next day, and everything was still there. Example of a water hole. This is actually a pretty good deal because the water hole is right up on top of a big rocky ridge where I wanted those cattle to be, so they kind of got rewarded for climbing the hill there. there's a lot of myths around wolves stifling the ability for ranchers to move ahead. Can turn out that way. This is a example of a neighbor about 25 miles south of where the ranch I look after. They take every April, this would have been about 15 years ago, they were still running yearlings in this allotment. Every April, about the middle of April, they would dump about 2,000 steers in an area where there was a wolf den. And as you can see, this little guy here, he's not gaining a lot of weight. He's hiding behind trees. And that bunch of wolves, every year they kill a bunch of steers. And then every winter they go in and kill a bunch of wolves, but they never do remove all the wolves, and they don't change their management practices. So it's just, it's kind of like wearing a bad fitting shoe on the same foot every day, or, and not changing it, just doctoring the callus every day. So that's what can happen. I would like to find out what their weight loss is every year, because it's not just the cattle that get killed by the wolf that you're losing. Over 2,000 steers that are traveling all the time because they're being pursued by wolves. If they lost on average, let's say 10 pounds a month, that's a pretty big chunk out of a rancher's pocket. But they got pretty deep pockets, and they seem to not want to change. So, and they like killing wolves, I guess. The picture of kind of an iconic wolf. The pack that uses the allotment I look after, there's actually 2 packs, but this female wolf here, in 2003, I had hell with wolves that summer. I had, I think by December, the end of December that year, I had lost up over 30, like confirmed kills, about 30 head. That was calves, yearlings, and cows combined. And then over and above that, I have poison, weed, and that kind of stuff that I lose cattle to also. So it was a pretty high death loss that year. But this wolf here, the summer of 2003, a biologist paid for by Defenders of Wildlife come in and put collars on 6 wolves. He collared 2 adults. Well, this was one of the adults. She was about a 3-year-old, 2 or 3-year-old wolf. And this picture here was taken in 2013. So if you do the math there, that's a pretty old wolf. She's still got the collar on, but it's inactive. And I think she probably died, the last time I seen her would have been that year. So I think she might have died maybe that year or the year after. But she actually became the alpha bitch, and she was that for probably from 2004 till 2008 or 9. And then she became a babysitter again at the rendezvous site. So she started as a babysitter, was the alpha bitch, and then become a babysitter again. Interesting thing about this wolf, I don't know if it's true, but I think she was witness to that summer of 2003. We eliminated, there was 17 wolves in that pack, and we eliminated all but 4 of them. And she was one of the ones that got to live. So I think that was the turning point in that pack. And that goes back to that thing about rewarding bad behavior. That pack of wolves that summer had got to the point where we had done all all the other stuff, the non-lethal stuff. And it was just to the point where there was no turnaround on that path. You would be one place and they'd be 5 or 6 miles over to the west or east or north of you killing a cow there. So, but anyway, like Hillary was saying, we learn from mistakes, and she taught me quite a bit that way. I'm always watching for wolf tracks, evidence of wolves, hair on barbed wire fences. I document everything I see like that, wolf tracks and hair, and scat. Usually take GPS coordinates of travel corridors and that sort of thing. And just an average wolf track there. I think that would have been April or May when I seen that track. Wintertime wolf trail. At first glance, you might think that's only 1 or 2, maybe 3 wolves, but it's actually 9 wolves made those tracks, because they all walk in the same footprints sometimes. A lot of times, this is the ugly part of the job that Carter's done a lot of, but sometimes I have to do that too. If Fish and Wildlife can't be there to do the necropsy, quite often I'll phone them and they'll just tell me, well, skin it out and take pictures and send the pictures to us, and if we have to, we'll come out and do a further investigation. This was actually done by a conservation officer, but I guess the reason I took pictures of this is because it was a junior officer that, I think it was her first year on the job, and she did a real thorough job. She skinned the whole animal out, and tried real hard to get a confirmation on it, but it wasn't. So I was pretty happy to see with what she did there. And we got one more video here, if we can play it. This is how I like to see cattle move. I'm actually up on a kind of a 2-track trail, and the cattle are down in a creek bottom, but they're still kind of going where I want them to. And that picture of the water hole, that's where these cattle are going. In a lot of the country I run cattle in, self-exposed slopes are always pretty open with not a whole lot of brush, but you get up on these north slopes, it's pretty heavy timber. I think maybe Blue wasn't listening. And then here's an example of one of my rendezvous sites. And this is actually in that one allotment where I put cattle in, usually the same time that I don't put them in the same time every year the wolves are using it. I try to alternate on a 3-year thing. On the years that I do have to put cattle in there, that's where I focus a lot of my time. Here's an example of one of my elk herds. There's quite a few more elk there than what you can see, but I think that in that bunch there was about 300 head there. But, yeah, and I've got a herd of cattle not too far from there too. That's probably mid-January, that picture. Managing cattle herds in conjunction with ungulates, wild ungulates. Kind of makes it to where, to be responsible, I have to be out there. I can't, if I was just to go to town and maybe sit in the saloon or something, who knows what would be happening? Well, I kind of know what would be happening. Stewardship. Hillary talked a lot about stewardship. Pretty important to me when we think about these big, vast, wide open spaces of land that we share with wildlife. Gosh, if one house is to get built on there, it's not very long. You're going to see condos and subdivisions and Walmarts and all that kind of stuff. So pretty important. This is an example of a bunch of my neighbors. We share a lot of help. So they'll come help me, and then in trade, I'll help them too. And that community's working together to keep these pieces of land in pretty good shape. Any questions?
Does anybody have a few quick questions? One over here, okay. Just a reminder, wait for the mic because apparently the people on the live feed can't hear questions unless you're talking down the mic.
So first, Hillary and Joe, thank you so much for being here and being a part of this event. It's, as we've talked in prior years, it's great to have the dialogue and viewpoints being shared. The one question I'd have for both of you is just to kind of get your sense. You're clearly out on the front of this. You're trying things out and you're finding some successes, and you have some failures, obviously, as you said, Hillary, but you're learning it. You're out in front of it. What kind of reactions are you getting? How do you feel when you interact with your peers in the ranching community as you're trying to share your successes with them? What sort of reactions are you getting from your peers, and are you seeing things moving your direction, or is there still a lot of resistance? So just curious about how you see things headed at this point.
Well, that's an interesting question because the place I look after is owned by 38 owners. It's a cooperative, basically, is what it is, and they trust me to look after their cows for X amount of months. And a lot of the owners will talk about the wolves in a bad way, and they'll also ask me, well, how come you're not shooting them wolves when you see them? But come the day I'm shipping those cattle out, maybe down the road, if they're trailing them home or putting them on the truck, and we count those cows out the gate, if they're all there, they don't really have an argument anymore. So, but I do, and in the past, other places I've worked, I actually had one place I worked at that I was instructed to shoot a pack of wolves or shoot some out of a pack of wolves that hadn't been bothering cattle, that I refused to do, and I lost my job over it. And so... But I guess just, I wasn't able to do that, knowing that those wolves weren't bothering cattle. So, but it was pretty easy to find another job. Yeah.
So I think we're going to move on. We can ask more questions of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, just one more to go, and then we'll have the panel. Really appreciate your patience. I know it's kind of a long haul to listen to people speak. Basically, Hillary and Joe and Carter said it all, so maybe it's good enough. But anyways, thank you again for this opportunity. Leopold, one of the pioneers of the early environmental movement, we as humans have come a long way since then. And all of us have had different experiences that have helped guide our journey, whether it's in wolf conservation or rather it's in ranching. So I just want to share from you a little bit from my experience and what I have learned that is a little bit different from other people in the room have experienced and learned, and also highlight a little bit about the working circle model that we talked about earlier. So going back just a bit to the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone. In conversations that I've had with folks that were there, I was not there, what I heard over and over again was, wow, what a great thing. But no one could truly predict what was to come as a result of this, meaning the tremendous celebration and the tremendous excitement that occurred over wolves as they continued their population growth and dispersed into other areas, but also the tremendous conflict and controversy and the division amongst whole communities that occurred. The hardship on the ranchers that were unprepared, not to mention the hardships on this animal itself. And unbeknownst to the wolf, he carries a great burden on his back ever since then. I mean, he's become a political instrument. He's become a tool for fundraising. He has become this symbol of wildness that urban folks feel have been lost. He has become a scapegoat in many ways for a lot of real challenges, for just being a wolf, doing what nature intended. Hunt, find a mate, disperse, be a wolf. But when I look at these pictures, you see them a lot. Oftentimes we over-glorify the wolf, and oftentimes you see the wolf over-villainized. And neither of these things help the wolf. It truly doesn't. So part of the conversation today is to bring some grounding to where maybe the truth lies in the middle there. But not only has the wolf carried a great burden on his back, but the folks who have been forced to share the landscape with them. And there's a lot of reasons why this has become a burden. One is often ranchers are marginalized because they're considered a minority, which I personally don't think that's the right way to look at it. If we looked at any other minority group that way, that probably wouldn't go over very well. Perhaps they weren't prepared for what it meant. Perhaps the resources weren't there to support them. And oftentimes we hear, well, gosh, depredation, wolves don't really impact the livestock community as a whole. Well, maybe not economically as a whole, but for the individual producer that experiences a loss, it is devastating. And it's not just on an economic level, it's on an emotional level. And I remember when I first learned that and heard that, it hit me really hard. So they do carry quite the burden because they're the ones out there living the life every day, living with wolves. It's super easy for us in our urban, and I'm one of them, urban communities to get so excited about this critter. And nobody loves wolves more than I do. But we're not the ones that necessarily have our lives impacted by them. And that's a reality that I think we need to recognize. So today, the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone is considered and celebrated as one of the most successful conservation stories of our time. As well it should be in many ways, especially in terms of population numbers alone. But I often ask myself in my own journey, has it really been successful? I mean, really. When you consider the conflict and controversy, the hardships on the people, and as we mentioned before, the hardship on this animal itself. I mean, look at what's happening now. I often think about Einstein's, I think he was credited with this quote, the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing over and over again, the same way, expecting a different result in each state that wolves move into. So I'm not convinced that it has been so successful, and maybe we need to take a look at that. Wolf recovery isn't a linear process, and neither are the challenges that go with it. And through my experience, I believe strongly that if you continue to take this approach, we're not going to improve the way things are. We can't just look at the wolf alone. The landscape isn't the same as it was 100 years ago, neither for wolves, for the people that live there, and for increasing human populations. We need to take a look at the wolf and the people and livestock and consider those three equally in value and as part of the greater picture if we want to have a different way forward. We need to look towards changing the paradigm of how successful is defined and approached based on these three factors. I kind of look at it like that three-legged stool analogy, right? If you just take out one of those legs, it collapses, and we see it collapse a lot. So how do we change that paradigm of how success is defined and approached to ensure that everyone's values are met and it can be successful? Well, one way we've been experimenting with it, and it has been an experiment, is through a model that was started in California that we're hoping to now bring into Colorado called the Working Circle Proactive Stewardship. And basically, community-empowered initiative dedicated to ensuring that shared wild and working landscapes can thrive in the modern world, and accepting the fact that today's world is very different than it was 100 years ago. Because the fact is, with increasing human population, competition for open space, wolves are dependent, as Hillary mentioned, on much of the lands that ranchers keep open and the wildlife habitat that they provide. The and in the middle is getting very fuzzy because co-occurrence with wolves and livestock are going to happen and does happen. So something to consider. All right, so the model basically serves to empower communities, bring diverse communities together, both within ranching and as well as urban and rural communities, foster working ranch stewardship, facilitate the implementation of long-term meaningful strategies, not the shortcuts, not the Band-Aids, but sustainable strategies long-term, and support practices that increase ranch resilience that both Hillary and Joe talked about, and then provide some of those initial resources to make this happen. You know, if we want wolves, we need to take responsibility of what that means for the people living with them. All right, so the basic foundation of it is basically, you know, merging ranchers' knowledge and experience of the landscape. Nobody knows the land better than they do. Nobody knows the land better than Joe and Hillary and folks that are out there. Nobody understands what's going on out there more than they do. So respecting that, understanding that, allowing them to be part of the process, and understanding that these are intelligent, smart people, they've had to be, to live this amazing life that they live. You manage that with some of the herding and management strategies we've talked about, with the science of large carnivore behavior and biology, and it is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible for producers to work around these predators and also benefit from some of the incidental benefits of some of these strategies. All right, but understanding really is the first step. You know, and again, it's not about changing people's minds. It's not about asking people to give up their value system. It's about meeting them where they're at. And it's about understanding their values and respecting that. Again, that coming together that we have talked about. For me personally, it's been an amazing, amazing journey, which we'll talk about in a minute. But, you know, as I mentioned often, or I've mentioned before, is that a lot of times what we have found, or what I have found, it's not even the wolf. It's what the wolf represents. That urban misunderstanding, that urban persecution. And oftentimes our actions, well-intended, doesn't always serve the cause we say we want to serve, because we fuel that polarizing debate, we fuel that fire, and nobody wants to be backed in that corner, right? And so again, it's just thinking about how we go about it and our messaging, and being open-minded to the bigger picture that goes beyond this. And for me personally, I feel like I've been very blessed having the opportunity to spend a lot of time on ranchers, for those ranchers that were willing to take the risk on me, open up their hearts and their homes to give me some of these experiences that I felt like kind of raised this veil of understanding, you know, and allowed me to look at the issue from the inside out versus what I was taught by reading studies or, you know, my conservation world. And one of the things that I learned is that, you know, a lot of times the science, the polls, the studies don't always translate to the realities of what's happening out there. You know, coexistence is not a behind-the-desk exercise. It's not a paper exercise. It's boots on the ground. It's face-to-face with real people, having those conversations. It's real and it's raw, but it's also a lot of hope. I've seen so much hope out there that I'm pretty excited, actually. So anyways, one of the things, you know, I came to realize early on, spending time with families like the Hansons here, multi-generational families, very proud of what they've done. You know, they love the land. They love their animals. They care about them. When they're in their care, they care about those animals very much so. They care about the wildlife. Their value system are pretty amazing out there. You know, I think a lot of our kids these days can learn from some of these families. You know, they are extremely proud of the fact that by adjusting some of their grazing strategies, they now have a sage grouse luck on their ranch. And they think that's really cool. I mean, these are stewards of the landscape. They truly are. So understanding the landscape, of course, is important. We spend time out there monitoring the landscape, getting to know what's happening out there for ourselves, spending time with the ranchers. They take us around. It's great because they know more than we do. Put some cameras for camera monitoring as well, but usually the pictures you get are not what you always expect, and they're usually not wolves. Don't often get wolves, but those are some of the funny ones that we took in California from different producers we were working with. We partner with producers and do what we call these kind of risk assessments. But the idea is that we're not telling them what to do. We are listening to them. They're showing, maybe we have somebody like Joe who's had experience living with wolves, can come down and then co-create a plan that's reflective of their needs. It kind of goes back to that, you don't own what you don't create, right? And so that's part of what this is. Because one of the mistakes that we've made often is when there's a conservation issue, you know, sometimes conservation groups want to swoop in, take ownership, start telling people what to do, instead of realizing these people really already know what to do. They just need support and some guidance from other folks. I won't go into all this detail because Joe and Hillary talked about it, but part of the focus behind the program is to, you know, implement these strategies that can help reduce vulnerability in cattle and increase that ranch resilience, so that producers can not only absorb a certain amount of loss, but just be better off from it. And it's really rewarding when you can see this. Well, I see it from the sidelines because I'm not a rancher, but it's pretty neat to see it in action. The way we implement it is through our Range Steward program, which is a comprehensive range riding program that kind of implements all the dynamics that you've heard about today. It's very comprehensive, but it takes time, it takes resources, it's not easy. But it's incredibly rewarding. You know, the thing about this program is that it is an experiment by design, and we too have made a lot of mistakes and will continue to make mistakes. But what I value about the folks, both on the conservation side and the ranching community, that are invested in it, is that they were willing to take the risk to enter that arena that you heard Hillary and Joe talk about. So it's pretty neat to see this evolve. But the idea is it is the ranchers working with ranchers. The idea is it is community-driven, community-run. This is their community, and they should have ownership, and we want to reduce that outside reliance on long-term assistance. Doesn't mean we can't partner with them. The whole idea is partnerships between different groups, but empowering the folks to teach each other and work with each other in implementing what needs to be done. Going back to a little bit of the ranch resilience and something that Joe was talking about, through some of the grazing practices, what I have learned is how amazing some of these grazing practices are for the land. You know, I'll be honest, I get a little tired of hearing how, you know, gosh, grazing is destroying the landscape and it's the source of climate change and all of these things. But, you know, they're just like we are learning how to recycle, you know, go green, solar panels, all this stuff. We're changing a lot of our practices. You know, the ranching community, as we've heard from everybody, as conservationists, are also adopting and changing and learning. And there's a lot of great science that's showing that, you know, using nature's model and how you graze, how it's improving soil health, how it's able to absorb carbons from the atmosphere, how it improves water health. And what's really cool to me when I think of this concept is that through some of these grazing practices, you can improve ungulate habitat. You can actually improve the habitat for elk and deer, the prey that wolves need, through ranching. And that's pretty powerful to me. So just, you know, a lot of really dynamic things happening out there as part of all this. And of course, it kind of comes in full circle. I like to bring awareness to the fact that through these strategies and the efforts that ranchers put out there and the value that they bring, you know, hopefully can help people become aware and support what they're doing. You know, ranchers are busy ranching. They don't have the time to be out there advocating for themselves or trying to do what Hillary and Joe are today. So, you know, I feel very honored to have the opportunity to talk about it because they are a very important part of this wolf picture, and we need them in order for wolves to be on the landscape. You know, and we talk about the need to compromise a lot, and one of the gals I work with in California, Rancher Brianna, she's like, you know, really, there is no compromise here. I'm like, what are you talking about? And what she was saying was, you know, a lot of times when we mention compromise, it's a stumbling block because it means that somebody has to give something up to make it work. But in this model, our hope, and it's a long-term journey, is that everybody can win here. You know, by implementing some of these things we've heard about today and working together and supporting each other, you know, not only can we have wolves on the landscape and reduce, you know, the need for lethal control, but ranchers can thrive as well, and we have healthy landscapes. It's a win-win scenario. And to me, that brings a lot more hope and promise than wolf wars and, you know, kind of going at each other all the time. I love this picture. This was a group, inner city kids in Oakland, that knew about one of the ranchers we were working with, the Truax family, Rancher Jesse, and they drew this picture and they all signed it and wanted us to send it to her because she was implementing these practices and she lives in wolf country in California. Not that Rancher Jesse wanted to be known for saving wolves by any means, but she appreciated the fact that these inner city kids recognized the value of what she was trying to do. And it goes back, actually, I stole this quote from Hillary, if our mindset is different, then our activities will be different. And you know, we ask a lot of times for other people to change their mindset so we can have wolves. We need to change our mindset first to make it work. And again, yeah, important to move beyond those myths, right? There's myths surrounding wolves, and there's myths surrounding ranchers, and that doesn't help any of us move forward. And so through our workshops, whether it's working with the ranchers, or rather I'm out giving talks, you know, we kind of talked about this earlier, producers can't make good decisions based on myths surrounding wolves, but neither can the urban public make good advocacy decisions based on myths surrounding the ranching community. The next generation, that's key. I love to tell this story. This is actually Jessie, and she was our first range rider in California, and her son. But what's amazing is when I met her parents, I went to a meeting that another producer set up in Siskiyou County. And wow, they weren't happy I was there. You know, why are you here? You wolf lover, we don't want you here. We don't want your wolves. We resent that you came here. And it was a tough meeting, but we talked, we listened. It ended up being very productive and very promising. And I learned a lot, I always do. But her parents were, they still weren't happy that I was there. So that's okay. You know, it's a start. They showed up. They came to the table. They showed up. But the next morning I got a call from Jesse's mom saying, you know what? We thought about what you said last night. First of all, thank you for taking the risk to come to this meeting. And we realized that we need to think about that next generation. Wolves are coming to California. It's a reality. So we'd like to get Jessica involved because she's going to inherit our ranch. She wants to take it over. So Jessica did. She went twice now, I think, or 3 times to Hillary's place for range rider training. And but the first time she came back, she's like, this isn't going to work. You know, there's never going to work on my landscape. You know, Hillary kind of talked about that. But you know what? She went out there. She experimented. She tried different things. She was like, gosh, I never realized that my cattle did this, or, you know, that we had mountain lions over here. And she was learning so much about the landscape. And you know what? She found a way to make it work. She adapted what she learned and is making it work for her and her family. And she's really excited. But it's been a lot of work for her. And she takes her little son with her out every day. So for her parents, it was like, ooh, the scary new territory, very skeptical. Jessica learning, doing the hard work. But when her son grows up, it'll be the norm for him. And that to me is really cool. And one thing we've recently talked about with the Working Circle is how we can maybe collaborate with different, you know, ag youth groups maybe and create kind of training programs for the next generation of range stewards for tomorrow to ensure we have those open landscapes for wolves to live on. So looking forward, I do have a lot of hope. I really do. We're all learning. We're all going to make more mistakes. You know, we talk about wolves, you know, potentially coming to Colorado or being reintroduced to Colorado. Yeah, I've struggled with that. Do I want wolves? Oh my gosh, I'd love to hear wolves. But I've struggled. Are we ready? Have we learned enough? Is it the right thing to do? Are we just creating another killing field? However, when you look at Colorado, the habitat, the prey base, the strong support for wolves, I believe there could be a meaningful way to do it if we do it the right way. We can change that paradigm, change the paradigm of how we consider success when we talk about wolf recovery in different areas. And in closing, I love this quote. If you're trying to build bridges between diverse communities and build understanding and respect, it takes more than meeting in the middle or just building on common ground, because wolves are so polarizing. And one of the things we need to think about is think about our efforts in terms of how can we not polarize it more. And one of the things the Working Circle is trying to do is neutralize that polarizing debate that doesn't help wolves, nor does it help the people living on the landscape with them. It's time to start working towards solutions instead of against each other on many of these issues. But before you get there, you've got to create a field, a safe place for those conversations to happen. And that can often be the hardest part, right? And if you create that field, you cannot expect everybody to just come running into the middle, kumbaya, and everything's great. Sometimes what it requires is walking to the other side of that field and reaching out your hand. Thank you.
Are you guys sitting up
Yes,
there?
so we're going to get the panel
Okay,
back up.
so I just have to move a chair. Does anybody have a quick question?
Oh, you want to do that?
Yeah, why don't we do that?
Yeah, we'll do a quick bit.
A quick 5-minute bathroom break, and then we're going to get to the panel.
question. Well, no, there's a, well, and so is Idaho. But the thing is, we can't just keep doing it the same way, you know? And Hillary's a start, Joe's a start. Like, get at the root of the issue. Why do we dying? Lethal tank. Why do ranchers want to kill those? Figure out how to solve that issue. And that's what we're trying to do. Hillary never wants.
Exactly right. No, this has been such a smooth.
Most of my travels anymore, I have requested day ahead.
Yeah, that's the selling point. We do, and that's
Well, technically you
talk
want
about benefits wolf and no wolf.
so you'll still make
You
it.
know, here's that's another thing I tell people.
This is going straight
The
into
wolf is a huge opportunity.
up.
There's money, you know, resources to help do all of these.
I'm not going after them, it's the agency.
I agree, there's tons of
But we can't
problems.
get around that
I don't want
mindset.
the agency spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to kill wolves when there are ranchers in Washington that are being
We'll get
turned
there.
away.
You know, it's not gonna happen overnight.
I think that
That's wrong.
I think that there's, unfortunately, there's just this dark side, and most of Montana is that. Like it is
And
what
it's
you
so
said.
frustrating.
It is
I mean, you know, it's
finding carcasses, getting compensated, killing
what?
wolves,
Someone's got 'em.
leaving cattle
Nobody
back there.
did?
Not, but I think that figuring
so even
out,
though we,
like,
you know, you do the 2 steps forward, 2 steps back thing, you still gotta do
how are
it.
you gonna
But it takes people like you.
I want that as much as you. Like there's nothing that makes me
So I think we can grab some water.
Of course not.
That's why I have to go back up. And we'll talk more after.
Of course
Are we
not.
going to dinner tonight? Or are we going to happy hour? What are we doing? I'm not letting you guys out of my sight.
and kill wildlife services and kill
Is that okay? Okay.
I would imagine you're angrier than we are.
Hey, honey.
Don't go real close.
It's okay. I got nervous.
Okay.
I'll adjust it there.
Yeah. It was so funny. I look over. I'm like, don't look at me.
None of this dropping.
Because if somebody actually knows, I'm just going to get some
We
water.
won't drop the mic.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
You're good, okay?
Careful, honey.
I thought we were
Oh, you
ending
poor
at
thing.
5:30, so I actually have to get out of here like at 5:40 because I have an appointment, but I don't want to be rude.
I can't believe
So
you're both
if
here.
I
I can't tell you how
leave, that's why I'm leaving. Otherwise, they're
hoping
going to
she might
charge
be
me a lot of
here.
money for an
We're
appointment I
trying to get her
didn't
to
make.
visit me in Colorado.
Are we gonna stand or sit, or what are we gonna do?
We're going to sit cross-legged.
Oh, she's amazing.
we're
Our
gonna-
questions are good.
We're gonna. Oh.
I mean, I've learned so much from her. She keeps me like, when I get all worked up, she keeps me right here.
I am going to
She's
get
just,
you
no,
my
you
phone
won't.
so
So
that
she
I-
did get worked up. After Ember went. That's about as worked up she gets. Because she was like, I'm changing my
Okay,
talk.
will
I'm
you
like,
let me know? Will you let me know when it's 5:30? Thank you. Thank you. Sorry to do that.
sneaking behind you. Okay, ready. Ready.
That's not true. I've heard you speak before. Yeah, you bet.
1, 2, here we go. Okay, folks, we're about to start, so if you want to grab your seats. That sound okay?
Put anything in there? No, I'm just kidding.
We're about to start, folks, so if you want to grab your seats. Just one quick announcement. Amaruk has an appointment at 5:30, so she's going to have to quietly slip out during the presentation, so don't mind when she does. And I'll let you know when it's 5:30.
Check 1, 2.
the moderator.
He wants me to unmic.
Well, I can moderate from over here.
Do you want us to take off these?
They're gonna run. No, I'm on. You guys, yeah, I'm the only one that's on live mic.
Yeah.
So we're gonna go ahead and get started. And as oh, he told me. Wait, you want me? He told me 1 minute. Yeah. I just follow orders. I follow instructions. Yeah. Yeah. No.
Not.
Testing. It works. Wow. Okay. All right. Start again. So anyways, thank you so much for hearing all of us today. I hope that you were able to learn a lot, gain some new insights. We really don't want folks to be shy. Please ask, any questions that you have in your heart and your mind. This is a time to learn. I'm looking forward to learning more. I've learned something every day from these folks regularly. I'm sure I'll learn from the questions presented here. So we've got Steve over here with the mic, and we'll go ahead and get started. And there's the hands. Matt's first.
So Hillary, I have a question for you, and that is, when I listened to your presentation, what I heard was an energetic, innovative, dedicated, passionate person, rancher. And I'm wondering, do you feel like you represent the average Montana rancher?
We started right out with one.
That's the short answer.
But I hope that I represent my generation and down. I hope that my generation and down, the ranches that are positioned to pass on a future of hope to the next generation are strongly in alignment with many of the things that I talked about, because there's a lot of challenges, not just wolves, that we face every day, and it takes creativity and it takes passion and heart, because we all know that it doesn't pay. Like, nobody ranches for the money, and so you gotta love it. Yeah.
Great question.
First of all, thank you for being here and showing us the positive side, because all we see is the negative side mostly, and we appreciate that. My question is, a lot of times we hear if they would just remove the carcasses of dead cattle, it would make things a lot better. I'm sure that's got to be a monumental task out in the field. How do you do that?
Well, is this on? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is times where I'm able to remove a carcass, but it's a small percentage of time. So what I do, instead of removing the carcass, I'll manage the carcass. If I have to, I'll move cows away from the carcass. If I can't move cows away from the carcass, I tie up my presence around in that area where the carcass is.
Pretty much really similar to Joe. The other thing that I'd add is, I would agree with you that, like I said on my slide about the idea, this other community doing this great program that we wanted to do the same thing. They were all about removing calf carcasses around calving grounds in the winter, which is very different than adult cows many miles back on Forest Service allotments. And so the question for us really is, what actually is the effect of carcasses on depredation? And the common myth is that, and you hear this all the time, is like once wolves get a taste for beef, then it's all downhill from there. And I always say, like, wolves don't hunt based on, like, I would prefer tenderloin tonight instead of chicken, and so it's like they kill what they can catch and they catch what's most vulnerable. And so our goal is reduce vulnerability in the live livestock. And if the presence of the carcass, sometimes that creates a higher level vulnerability. Sometimes it doesn't. But like Joe's saying, if we're not out there, you're never going to know. So it's really an adaptive thing. What we found is that carcasses placed randomly in space and time don't have any association with depredation, as opposed to if you have historical or current sites where bears or wolves were used to coming to get food, and now all of a sudden the food's gone and you move cattle into there, that sort of situation. So it's really, like Joe said, there's a ton of different things we might do, but it's always really specific to that certain situation.
Thank you. Great presentation. I mean, really, just awesome. You know, Joe, Hillary, you guys fire me up. Seriously, I haven't eaten a cheeseburger in a while, and now I'm ready to go have another one. So we hear a lot about sort of what the ranchers can do. You know, more non-lethal or whatever the case may be, and all the great stuff you're talking about. What can we do to support you? I mean, like what can a person who loves wolves do to help your business, do to help you guys be successful?
I just wanted, before you answer, you just started it right there. That's step one. Asking the question is huge.
Listening to our story, yeah. Asking. You wanna? You go first.
Yeah, I think, like Hillary just said, asking that question is the first step, and Karen said that too. And also taking what you've learned here and what you've heard us say, and broadening that, get it out to more people, and maybe next year they'll need a bigger room for the coexistence panel. That's what my hope is.
I'd add, I think that sometimes, I bet most of you guys have connected this, which is why these papers are here. But, agricultural practices are a result of consumer pressure. Or consumers, unlike shoes or clothes or houses or whatever, everybody eats. and all of us ranching and farming produce food. And you can either produce food with values or without values. And so you hold tremendous power as a consumer in making the choice to buy food produced. For each animal that we raise, all natural, grass-fed, wolf-friendly, whatever, it's like all the care from soil on up to coexistence with grizzly bears is consolidated into a 1-pound package of burger that you can buy to support the ranchers doing it right, I guess. But as long as there's a consumer industry that supports beef with no values, you're gonna have the dark side of agriculture predominate. So I would say eat beef, but eat it. Really, like, food for us is a celebration. Like every raspberry, every bite of a hamburger, it's like all my kids, like, we sit around the table and thank the animals and the plants. Like, thank you for this life exchange that we're participating in, and so every time we dismiss that, we're accidentally making a choice to support the other side. So that's a small thing. Big thing would probably be a lot more we'd have to talk for a lot longer.
I'd like to add to that answer, if I may. Supporting ranchers means making sure that they've got the resources that they need. My talk was about our need to hold our agencies accountable so that they're following the law, they're following the science, and that they are actually providing the assistance and the non-lethal measures so that hopefully we will have wolves still living and livestock still living. So in those instances when agency budgets are coming up at the legislature, that's your opportunity to call up your legislator and say, I want a big chunk of this budget to go to the agency for non-lethal measures. I heard for the last 3 years, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has been turning away people who want financial assistance for non-lethal measures on their ranch, and they've already spent close to $400,000 over the last 6 years killing wolves for one single rancher, when there's tons of other ranchers out there who want those measures and need the resources and are being turned away. So you can vote with your buying dollar at the market. You can vote by picking up the phone and calling your legislator and asking for a meeting with them. You can come to commission hearings and testify about this same thing and say, your surveys in your states, if they do, show that, yeah, people think that wolves should be killed when there are chronic depredations, but they want the primary focus to be non-lethal measures. So let's you, the commission, do what you need to do to support the agency that's working for all of us to make sure that those resources are available for the ranchers who want them.
So Hillary, quick question related to this. Where do we buy your meat? 'Cause I mean, a lot of the times, you know, it goes through a processing factory and it comes out the other end and we don't know that you raised your cattle ethically and someone else didn't. Do you self-produce? Do you pack your own meat and sell it? Can we buy it?
Yes, on all of those. The challenge, and I think Karen said this, but like Joe and I and my husband and Joe's wife, like we're good at working with cattle and tracking wolves and stuff like that. We're not marketers. and then like both of us, we live, like my kids go to a school with 28 kids in the whole school. And so it's not like there's not a big consumer population who's ready to pay an extra $1 for the beef. So like what we need help with is somehow connecting our product to consumers. Somebody with those skills and those ability to be like, hey, we wanna bridge this gap. So, but the answer is yes, you can. Where you can find it, I'm not sure.
So I can answer a little bit of that. You know, if you go online too and do some research, you can find where you can actually order, you know, beef online from some of these places. Through Cal Wolf Center, Christina set that up with the Truax Ranch called Shasta Wild, and the little sticker on all the packages that says California Wolf Center endorsed beef. But the idea is that what Jessica has found by doing this, because it is a little bit more work and she gets a little bit more money for, you know, that beef, but she has great conversations with folks because her email's there. And so when you order her beef, you know, you can email and talk to her, and it's a great conversation with folks that are supporting, you know, folks like, you know, Hillary or Jessica, and putting these practices together, and it's been really, really cool. You know, Jessica's found that it was almost more valuable by having these conversations than even the extra dollars she was making. But obviously she was grateful for the extra dollars too, because then she applies it right back to her ranch. But there's a lot of promise in that, I think.
So you can start that search by Googling predator-friendly beef. That'll get you a really good list to begin with. I have a question for Joe and Hillary. First off, thanks for being here today. When I go to hearings and ranchers testify about the problems they have with wolves, at one time it was depredation, and now what I see moving in a lot more is, I think they're using the word wasting, the loss of weight due to the cattle being afraid of wolves or moved around by them. Could you talk about how that fits into each of your situations?
Yeah, I sure can. I guess it was about 18 years ago. There was one of my neighbors had a bunch of yearling steers that he had just brought out of the mountains, and these cattle, I think there was about 100 head of them, and they were pre-sold. I think the delivery date from the time he gathered them into a small hold-up field close to his ranch, there was about a week wait time there, the delivery time. So he put them on a good piece of grass where they could maybe gain a little bit more weight. And the wolves got in there on the second night. This hold-up field was about a half-section field. So those wolves got in there and started working them steers, just kind of like they were doing those buffalo on your video last night. And they did this for about 4 or 5 nights. And I guess I'll step back a little bit. These cattle were weighed when he brought them out of the mountains. So he put them in this hold-up field, and he was going to weigh them again onto the truck. So over 100 head with 4 days, I think it was 4 nights, those steers were harassed by the wolves. They never did kill one, but I think overall each animal lost 8 pounds. So if you add that up over 100 head, that's almost, that could be your profit almost. So
You sell the cattle by the pound, not by the head.
that's right. Yep.
I would just say really quick, adding to that, 2 things. One personal story is a neighbor turning cattle out, having the cattle genuinely being stressed and losing weight due to being run around by predators, but again, not changing anything. So like, leaving them back there because it's like, well, this is our grass resource and it happens to be in the middle of this bad area. And so getting more creative, and again, that's the collaboration with BLM and Forest Service and all of that. How can we strategically use this grass resource? How can we build flexibility into our operation to be adaptable as different things come up? The other thing is that, you know, most ranches that say that, it's more anecdotal than real, because most of them who make that complaint that I hear don't know actually what the weights were when they turned out. Half of them don't even know how many they turned out. You know, and so that's again the kind of the bar is set pretty low from the ranch side of things. And so getting at more like what's really the issue for them, what are they really actually upset or concerned about, because a lot of them, if you actually weighed the cattle, there might be a whole bunch of other factors that go into that. And that's our comment about building resilient ranching businesses, not just like getting focused, because usually if they really are losing weight, there's usually a lot of factors that go into that. So I'm not dismissing it, it's just there's more to consider.
Can I just have a question on that. I don't know if it was, sorry, I have my thing. I'm the only one that's mic'd. I don't know if it was Witt or someone, maybe it was just one of the ranchers visiting. So it seemed to me, one of the things I remember hearing is that through rekindling the herd instinct and bunching them up, making that herd a safe place to be, the cattle are more confident, for lack of a better word, in the presence of predator, less stressed. And so that helps that presence scenario. Is that true?
We have terrific weight gain throughout the communities, with the exception of every once in a while, one herd in one pasture in 1 year, something goes wrong. And Carter has worked with a woman who's doing a study on that.
You're referring to Azura?
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been helping Washington State University, and little gal is in one of my pictures in my past presentations, Azura Valerio. She's from Italy, and she's looking at the metabolics of the relationship between cattle and wolves. So if it's complicated, but we had proximity collars this time. This is something new to me too, but the collars on the wolves talk to the collars on the cattle. And when the two come together within 125 meters, they record data, and then she could respond the next morning by finding the cow that had the interaction with the wolves for a specific amount of time, watch the cow, and as soon as the cow took a poop that she could see fresh, she'd go in and collect that, put it in plastic bag, and quick freeze it with dry ice. So the bottom line is she's trying to look at the stress levels in the cattle when wolves come around them, and are they indeed reacting negatively or not. And her work is very preliminary. There is differences between how the cow's metabolics are before and after it interacts with a wolf. And now she's trying to get this all measured in some way, but still her preliminary measures show that there's not a whole lot of stress when a wolf walks through the cattle. And she can also, through the GPS collar, see if there's been a chase versus just wolf and cow in the same neighborhood. So anyway, I think it's exciting research, and I think that's the beginning of more significant work to get to the answers about just what's going on.
It would be fascinating to do that, like in different scenarios, like cattle that are handled like how you handle them versus cattle that are scattered, you know, to test that theory on that. Anyways, that's cool.
The only thing I'd caution you against is going to the ranching community and dismissing, you know, giving them a study and saying this actually doesn't really affect your cattle. You know, like, because the reason why they're bringing that up is because they believe, you know, that it could. And they're fearful, and they feel like their voice hasn't been heard, and they're leveraging what they can. And so validating that, and then doing what we were talking about, which is like, okay, so what sorts of circumstances have you observed this happening with your livestock? Like the one ranch, we saw, like, okay, here's a set of circumstances that led to a bad situation. What can we do to change that? Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen where, when we're talking about stress in cattle, I've seen where, take the wolf right out of the picture, I've seen some pretty stressed cow herds just from bad handling. But I've also watched where wolves will walk through a herd of cows, and they'll be going along, and there'll be cows grazing, there'll be cows laying down. Everything will be pretty quiet. But just for an example, there might be, let's say, 8 wolves. 7 of them wolves will just go along minding their own business. But because wolves never, from what I know about wolves anyway, they don't go by something without testing it. So all it takes is one wolf just to step across. There's always a line there. Just to step across that line, or maybe act a little bit different. And then instantly you can see a bunch of cows switch. And if they haven't been handled properly, you can see a bunch of cows on the run, especially yearling cattle. They flight, they panic, they run, and that's what the wolf's looking for. So that would be a pretty easy meal for a pack of wolves if they can get a bunch of cattle just to jump up and run. There's always going to be a weak link there. So that's why the low-stress livestock handling is so effective in rekindling that herd instinct and keeping that. Even if a wolf does step across that line, it's not going to be a big deal to that herd of cows.
I got a quick story too. I've watched cattle and wolves interact up in Montana in the early days, and kind of like Joe describes, I watched wolves walking around cattle and cattle grazing, and when a wolf stand more alert and stares at them, then all the cows lift their heads and look at the wolf. And then the wolf could read that, so then the wolf began to walk away or walk around, and then the cattle go back to grazing. And I've seen cattle just in reverse. they see a wolf cutting across the field, and I've seen a V of Angus on that wolf's hiney all the way across the field till it went under the barbed wire. So there's even those situations that if you're in the right place, the right time to see it happen, it can go either way.
Kind of goes back to that all these scenarios and all these questions. I mean, we're all different. The animals are all different. The scenarios are all different, and you can't just put a blanket, statement on any of this.
So I have more of a comment and an offer, and it's actually a perfect segue of what you just said. Because remember last year we were talking about, to Steve's point, how do we find the products that are coming from ranches like Joe and Hillary's, and we had various labels, and then the process didn't always support the label. And I'd just like to acknowledge Predator Friendly. Joy and Steve are here today. And I think this room tells you that if we could easily provide the general consumer, like the Dolphin Safe kind of situation, a way to find you in the supermarket aisles and others like you in the supermarket aisles, then that would go a long way to this movement being successful. So my offer is, as a marketer, and other marketers, use us. We can help. We can create the brand, whatever it is, but we need to understand the intricacies to get there, because I remember last year there was a lot of challenges associated with that. But we're willing to step up and help if you guys want us to help with that.
Wow. We do. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I have a couple questions, so hopefully this won't take too long. But one quick question was on carcass management. I hear a lot about lye could be used to render the carcass inedible. Is that true? What does it do? How does it impact wildlife or wolves that might test that carcass with lye applied to it? I just don't know. I've just heard that spread quite a bit as an option. Another question I had too was we often in the conservation community look at the USDA statistics on depredations and livestock deaths, and so that's often used as a talking point that says, only 1% of livestock deaths are due to predators. And I'm really curious about your experience and how that hits you as a person when you hear something like that being said, in your own experience. I'm curious. And then one last question I had, maybe, for any of you, was if you've noticed some incident in a wolf pack that caused that switch from native prey to cattle. I mostly follow the Mexican wolf reintroduction program, and so just in my anecdotal observations, it seems like there's some triggering factor, like a death of a member of the pack. Some of the wolves have been accidentally caught in traps set by private trappers. Something happened, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of depredations that kick in. So I'm just curious if that's something you've also noticed. Thanks.
Well, I can answer or try to answer the last question you had. I don't believe wolves discriminate between wild prey and domestic livestock. But what they do discriminate between is the vulnerability of the two. So that's why if we can keep our livestock from being vulnerable, it's not like wolves decide that, well, I don't want to eat elk today, I'm going to eat cow. It just depends. They're still testing that cow when they go by it. But if we can keep that cow from being more vulnerable, that's what'll keep that switch from happening. And then also, you asked about the change in a pack that I've had quite a bit of experience with a pack of wolves that every winter, the one pack I deal with, every winter it seems like 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 of those wolves get eliminated from hunters and trappers and natural cause death. That's always creating a vacuum of other wolves to come into that pack. So I might have a good pack this year, but the following year I'm going to have to retrain that pack to keep them a good pack. So it's always a struggle that way.
On your question about lye, toxins of any kind, it's discouraged, and burial is the best. Deep burial is the best way to get rid of the carcass if you can. And like in the state of Washington too, they've got a couple of sites now that are compost sites. And there's a real science to that. You can read about it, but if you put a cow carcass, even a 1,000-pound animal, in this compost mix that they've developed, in a week or two, that animal disintegrates with very little odor and can be gotten rid of on the surface of the ground just by the mixture of the nitrogen and, you know, wood chips, and I don't know the mix off the top of my head, but it's better than putting lye or some potentially toxic chemical on a carcass.
And if I could just real quick address a little bit from what I've learned about when that statement is made, oh, it's less than 1%. And it's, just to build a little bit on what I said, you know, it may be true that most ranchers will never see a wolf, most ranchers won't ever have issues with wolves, but when you just dismiss it, because for those that are impacted or living with wolves, it can be very challenging. And for the smaller rancher, economically, it can be devastating. And ranchers don't, you know, when you just dismiss it like, oh, well, only 0.5%, you know, you can imagine what that would feel like, right? You know, because they're talking about their friends and their neighbors. And I remember Tom Compton at the Wolf Symposium down in Durango in Colorado. He was like, okay, so which one of us is a sacrificial lamb? You're just saying it's okay. So again, a lot of it goes back to how we message things, you know, whether it's factual or not, you know, how we put things out there that can come across either disrespectful or not being very understanding or empathetic of the real situation.
But nationally, proportionally, you know, predation is, by self-reporting, by surveys, is less than 5% out. So just roughly saying, you know, 95 out of 100 critters probably died from something other than predation. And that's why it was so important, like the work I did. You have to confirm and you have to look at these carcasses, and like you were talking about, through livestock handling, you can make them easier to find so that you can confirm what the problem is, because you don't want to waste a lot of time killing wolves when you have an ammonia problem or something.
I would maybe just add real quick to that. I agree with Karen that it's really in the messaging and it's reducing people's lives. So, you know, something that's a heart issue to a statistic, and that just doesn't ever feel very good. But it is good to keep in mind that, like Carter, you know, everybody's saying, it doesn't have to be as inflamed of an issue, but I think that, you know, there's also a lot of work that might go into keeping it at 1%. But between killing wolves and proactive efforts, and so recognizing, you know, there's just a lot that goes into that percent, I think. As far as the pack behavior, I think that I have as many stories as I have experiences that I've witnessed in terms of why wolves do what they do in terms of killing cattle or not. But the big thing I would say, or two big things, is that pack, like churn, you know, shooting up packs, usually for us creates a harder situation. Not just in terms of depredation, but in terms of our level of awareness. Like, we know where the dens are. We know we're working hard to coexist with them, and they're working hard to coexist with us. And anybody who's still left on the landscape has kind of figured it out, you know. And so keeping those wolves there
is a pretty big deal, and just shooting up them. And I have lots of stories about comparing different packs that way, but that would be the main thing that I'd say to that. But you really have all the tons of years of watching what leads to wolves killing cattle or not.
Yeah, and one of the things I talked about when I was working for Wildlife Services, if you've got coyotes living around sheep and they're not killing your sheep, leave those coyotes alone. They're being guard dogs for you. They're making their living eating rabbits and mice and small animals, and they're not dependent on sheep. And the same would go for a pack of wolves. If you establish that relationship and the wolves aren't a problem, that's the ideal situation. Leave those wolves alone. And that's really this problem with this intense hunting, trapping, and snaring of wolves, is it does create chaos in these packs and eliminates essential pack members a lot of times. And those packs need that whole composition to hunt as a unit and be effective. And when they're hampered or handicapped by having some of their pack members killed at random, it often does create a situation where they start preying on livestock. Goes with mountain lions and black bears, grizzly bears, everything.
So I can understand a sometimes tenuous relationship between ranchers and wolf advocates, but I'm wondering if you guys ever feel like you're being used as pawns by people who want to hunt and kill wolves in the name of helping ranchers, if that's really what they're doing, or just using you.
I've got a little bit of a story to talk about that. It doesn't involve wolves, but coyotes. This was just 3 winters ago. I had, I think it was about a week before Christmas, this truck come into the yard, and there was a middle-aged couple in there, and both of them were, you know, probably from the city. Anyway, nothing against city people, but they pulled up beside me and rolled the window down, and the fella asked me, he says, "I hear you got a coyote problem." And I said, "Oh?" And he says, "Well, we're here to look after your coyote problem." And I said, "Really?" I said, "I didn't realize I had a coyote problem, but..." And then he kind of backtracked and he said, "Well, could we go shoot some coyotes?" So my answer to him was, "So you like eating coyote?" He didn't know what to say. But yeah, definitely a lot of times we are used as pawns to justify the killing of wolves and coyotes.
I'd say on an individual scale, no, because we can, like Joe said, like see through that pretty quickly. But on a large scale, yeah, I mean, that's like the rancher is the bad guy, and we need, like on a big scale, yeah, absolutely.
You've indicated that community-based solutions are what should be pursued. And I was wondering if there's recognized best practices for livestock-wildlife coexistence. Do you and your community support rules, regulations, and enforceability of those best practices?
To date, there are no best practices, but I think all of us are working really, really hard to figure those out and put those out, and then empower and support people in that. I think that the way that I see it is right now, Wildlife Services, where we are, is really, really a strong, that whole scenario of like lose a calf, get compensated, and kill wolves. You know, there's almost no incentive to change. And so that would be where the big shift could come, as if there was agencies, not just a peer-to-peer. The peer-to-peer thing happens when you start talking about resilient ranching businesses and passing on things to the next generation. And if you're on that track, people are like, oh yeah, it doesn't really make sense to worry about killing wolves. Just it changes, but the system we have in place really incentivizes non-action, and that's what I think would be great to see shifted.
If I could add to that a little bit. Again, I don't come from an agency background, just sharing what producers have shared with me, and also what the one gentleman said at the rifle workshop. When it comes to regulations, and I kind of equate it to HOA situation, right? Where, you have to ask permission to plant a tree, or you can't do this, that, and the other. And what has been shared with me is, instead of just putting more regulations on us ranchers, more laws, more things that constrict us, that just kind of is treating us like we're idiots. Why not give us the resources or give us the opportunity to learn from other folks who have lived this? And obviously we're going to want to make responsible decisions so that we can be profitable, and we want to do the right thing for the right reasons. But if you make a law, don't put my salt block there, what's human nature? It makes you want to do that, when you're told not to do it. So really it's less about regulation and more rules than about offering resources and support so folks can make, good decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. The restriction and regulation and enforcement and all of that really would be a great way to tick a lot of people off. And I mean, so many wolves get killed, shoot, shovel, and shut up. People can they can do whatever they want. And so you have to really inspire a change. And I think inspiring that, for one, starts with not strongly incentivizing. If all the ranches in Montana had to up their game in order to get compensation or kill wolves, then maybe it wouldn't be in their best interest to stay within the status quo. And I'm going out on a limb here in dangerous territory. But it's a really loaded, it's a big thing. It's a big, complex issue, how to shift the tide, I think.
Yeah.
Just as an example, the place that I manage and look after cattle on, it's 100% public land. It's provincial public land, which is a little different than federal land. But yeah, I definitely have a whole bunch of guidelines that I have to stay within, and even as far as the amount of grass that I'm allowed to use every year. It's all charted out on an animal unit months, and overall the whole place has a maximum amount of animal units. And I have to stay within or below those guidelines. One of the guidelines is over the whole place, I have to leave an average of 60% of the grass. And that's to look after the elk and the deer and the moose, and all the other ungulates that use the landscape. But one thing that I would, and there's actually a group of, me and about 4 of my neighbors would like to try to, I don't think it'll ever happen, but it's kind of a humorous thing to talk about, is the registered trapline owners should have to put up a percentage of the livestock depredation compensation payouts, because every winter, because with trapping you can't be selective. It's whatever you catch is what you get. So there's been years where the alpha female has been caught out of the pack, and that created a whole lot of trouble. So yeah, I believe that there should be some payout by the hunter and the trapper.
And one of the challenges that just real quick, at least in California, and I think Hillary, you might be dealing with this, are facing is that on some of the public allotments, like Forest Service lands, some of the ways the grazing plans are set up or the permits are set up are kind of based on older science and don't necessarily allow some of the producers to change the way they graze or do this rotational grazing or some of these other strategies to help reduce vulnerability or improve the landscape because they're not allowed to. So, there's some groups like Defenders and others that are working with the Forest Service to try to set up like experimental modules or, get some of these regulations adjusted, kind of catch up with where we're going to today. Oh, is it time? Oh, okay.
Everyone will get plenty of time to ask some questions at the happy hour in a little bit because we're running a little late. So let's do a couple more questions and then we can move in.
Want to get her?
Oh, I was.
Okay, and then.
I've got the mic.
Oh,
I love the passion and dedication you guys have for the way you're producing and so forth, and being part of wildlife friendly and predator friendly. We're really in that side of, okay, how do we get it to market? How do we help you? Because you're doing all the work. And the issue we're finding is a lot of you're selling it to another producer, and then they're packaging it, and they're taking the markup. And so this is something that we're constantly dealing with, is making sure that you guys are really getting the full effect of all the work you're doing, and you're getting benefited for it. And so, when we talk about wildlife in just general, I mean, what is it, 50% of wildlife been lost in the last 40 years? And so we are trying to get, what we like to, our tagline is building economies to save ecologies. So how do we use consumer dollars to be able to turn this around? That's going to change legislation. That's going to cause those farmers, or ranchers, to say, oh my gosh, I need to do this because this is going to give me more money. And so we're on the marketing side, dealing with the larger food companies, and they want to actually do more grass-fed. And so these kind of certifications, we just finished a certification for Audubon. I don't know how many people knew about the Grassland Audubon Certified. That's another certification that grass-fed farmers can actually get, because we're losing our migratory birds, the grassland birds. And so we said, okay, how do we save them? We've got to end up making a certification. I know it's more rules, but you follow these certifications, and we're hoping that consumers will pay more. In the Audubon situation, they're actually paying more. But how many of you are seeking certifications, or would like predator friendly or wildlife friendly? Do you see those as benefits, or are you having a problem with the supply chain?
If the market was there, we'd all be doing it. I can guarantee our neighbors would be doing, the money's gonna talk. And they don't have a vendetta against swans and sage grouse and wolves, but right now, like, the regulations and rules suppresses their freedom. What you're talking about is raising the bar and being rewarded for it. You're talking about an incentive in a different direction. And no ranch trying to run a profitable operation in today's world, is going to go I think it might take a little bit of time, but I don't think it'll take, I know that our neighbors would buy in. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I had some other questions, but given we're kind of running out of time, I think for one of the most important things, obviously what you're doing is, it sounds like in many ways is a win-win. That if I understand correctly, your depredation losses are going down, less wildlife are being harmed, some are actually benefiting from it, and certainly less are being killed. But what we're running into a lot of times, like in the Montana legislature or before our Fish, Wildlife, and Park meetings, is especially now this increased war on predators, specifically wolves, and looking at grizz, and working within those of us that have are working in trapping reform and the truths in trapping. Any trapper that comes out, they're just slammed. Even recently, one of the sportsman groups that say they don't oppose trapping, they're being slammed because they don't want trappers to be reimbursed after wolves. So What we need, though, for part of this change is for people such as yourself that are practicing these, coexisting methods to go and speak out. And I guess that's my question. How difficult is that? Are you, it's like you said, really kind of stepping out there, but we're up against some major ag groups that come in, and agriculture is our #1 industry in Montana. So that's all they need to hear is if we say, hey, can we have trap checks, or can we, get these things going? It's like, oh no, because it's going to hurt their livelihood. So to be able to hear, I can talk till I'm blue in the face quite clearly, but to be able to hear from people that are living this, such as yourselves, to say, yeah, maybe we're not losing, quote, 1% or 5%, but it matters to us, but this is what we're doing. We don't want those packs disrupted. We don't want to increase more wolf trapping or more killing of these predators. We want other methods. And so I guess I'm just asking, how is that a possibility to get people such as yourselves that are successful at the commissioners' hearings, at the legislative hearings, because we need you, is I guess what I'm saying.
I can, in Canada, because wolves are wide open most of the year, if you have a hunting license, you can shoot all the wolves you want from September till I think it's the end of February. And if you're a rancher, you can shoot wolves year round if they're depredating, they're preying on your livestock. So I guess the other part of your question is how can we put ourselves out there to have a bigger voice? I guess that's why I'm in this room today, is to put that word out there about what we do. But I also put myself out there in Canada as far as what I do, and there's more than one of me, and we do team up a little bit and try to get a word out there for the general public to hear, and also our MLAs and our premiers and good old Justin Trudeau.
I think for me, to just have someone like yourself say, hey, there's this meeting at 3 o'clock on Wednesday, and we really need you to come and hear it, like that, because I certainly, and like my husband and all we're not worrying, we're not figuring all of that out, but if you, like Karen's like, it's at 2:30, you need to be in this room, just like, it's like, okay.
One last question.
Okay, I'll be quick and basically probably summing up already what some of us have already said. And just wanted to acknowledge the courage that it took for you to travel this distance and come to this group and be open and have this conversation. I have felt so hopeless the last couple of years over the wolf wars that are taking place. You too, and all of you standing up there, have given me the hope I needed to carry what you said to everybody I see from here on out. And I just want to really thank you for giving me personal hope. And when I used to think of ranchers, the Hollywood movies, I think, oh, that's so cool. And then lately it's, no, they're bad people. Well, now this conversation has really opened my eyes so much more than what I could ever find online. I can't find what you told me tonight online anywhere I've looked. But what you said and the way that you said it means so much. And I know it's costly and it's probably hurts being out on the land. And what I want to say too is, this idea of the rancher. To me, the old way, the way you're doing it, living on the land, being stewards, bringing back species, looking at the grasses, teaching your cattle how to behave differently,
you're the cutting edge to me. You're the new rancher. You're what we need. And seeing that little boy on the back of the horse was so much more meaningful to me than seeing the little kid looking in the dead eye of a coyote that he just shot. What you're doing, you're raising American children with the values that we need. So thank you. Thank you.
What a great way to end.
So
Thank you, Lucy. I just,
Go
no, I was
ahead.
just gonna say, I just want to thank everybody for taking so much time out of your day for this conversation. And I'm just reminded by the questions and like what Lucy shared, how important this work is. And I too am so, oh boy. So inspired by everybody here and by all of you. I do want to say, got to mention the book. There's a great book if you're interested. It's called Revolution on the Range. It talks about the new ranch model, actually. Highly recommend, even if you just read the foreword. For me, it was very game-changing in how I look at this. So just thank you, and thank you everybody here.
So just to wrap up, guys, before we go, I just want to, again, personally thank, when Paula and I went up to Oregon and we shared with Betsy, we sounded a lot like you did just now after we met these people. These people up here inspired us to do this event, inspired us to bring people together. So I want to thank Karen and Carter and Hillary and Joe. Really, thank you. You are inspiring. You changed our lives, and now you're changing more people's lives. So I'm really glad that we've all come together. So thank you so much. You can talk to these people at the bar with a glass of wine. It's going to be fun. Give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.